When my wife and stepdaughter heard the doctor say I had only 2 days left, my wife held my hand, smiled, and whispered finally, "2 more days, then it is all mine." My stepdaughter added, "I am taking his car." After they left, I called my gardener. "Help me and you will never have to work again." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your trust broken by the people closest to you, the ones you swore would always have your back. The room smelled of clinical bleach and impending death. I lay entirely motionless, a prisoner inside my own failing body, trapped in the cold luxury of the VIP suite at City General Hospital. The rhythmic, agonizingly slow beeping of the heart monitor was the only sound anchoring me to the living world. Dr. Simon Keller stood at the foot of my bed, his polished leather shoes squeaking faintly against the linoleum. He was holding a clipboard that officially dictated the end of my 72 years on this earth. My kidneys were shutting down. My heart was failing. I had 48 hours, perhaps less. I kept my eyes closed, forcing my breathing to remain shallow, and even simulating the deep, oblivious coma they all assumed I was trapped in. I felt a hand brush against mine. It was a soft hand, perfectly manicured, smelling of the expensive French perfume I had bought her for our anniversary. Barbara, my wife of 10 years. I waited for the tear to fall on my knuckles, for the choked sob to break the heavy silence of the room. Instead, she leaned in close. I could feel the warmth of her breath against my ear. Finally, she whispered, her voice completely devoid of any sorrow, ringing with a chilling, vibrant anticipation. 2 more days. Then it is all mine. The words hit me harder than the medical diagnosis. They did not just break my heart. They shattered the very foundation of my reality. A cold, absolute clarity washed over me, freezing the blood in my veins. From the corner of the room, her daughter Melanie chimed in, her tone as casual as if she were picking out items from a catalog. "I am taking his car. That vintage '69 Shelby GT 500 is mine. You can keep the rest of the junk." Barbara chuckled softly, a sound that made my stomach turn. "Just let the old man expire quietly, sweetie. No sudden moves. Then we can take inventory of the whole empire." They walked out of the room, their expensive heels clicking against the floor, a rhythmic, upbeat countdown to my supposed demise. As the heavy wooden door clicked shut, the silence returned, but it was heavier this time. I opened my eyes. The sterile white ceiling blurred as a massive rush of adrenaline fought through the thick, unnatural fog clouding my brain. This was not just a tragic illness. I smacked my dry lips together and tasted it. A strange, bitter, metallic tang lingering in the very back of my throat. It was the exact same taste present in the herbal teas. For the last 6 months, Barbara had insisted on brewing me a special detoxifying tea every single night. She would sit by my leather chair in the study, watching me with wide, concerned eyes, making sure I drank every last drop, playing the role of the devoted, terrified wife. I was not expiring from natural causes. I was being slowly, methodically poisoned in my own home. The realization was a bucket of ice water over my dying body. I was being murdered. The betrayal burned through my veins, igniting a primal fire I had not felt in decades. Before I was Lawrence Bennett, the wealthy founder of a nationwide freight logistics empire, I was just a guy who drove 18-wheelers through blinding blizzards across the Rocky Mountains. I built my company truck by truck, route by route, fighting off ruthless competitors, corrupt dispatchers, and unforgiving winters. I survived by being tougher, smarter, and infinitely more ruthless than the men who wanted to see me bankrupt. I was certainly not about to let a greedy wife and an entitled stepdaughter take me out with a teacup. I gritted my teeth and forced my left arm to move. The muscles screamed in protest. Every joint felt like it was packed with crushed glass. I reached across my chest and grabbed the IV line taped securely to the back of my right hand. The clear liquid dripping into my veins was supposed to be saline and pain medication, but right now I trusted absolutely nothing in this hospital, especially not Dr. Simon Keller. He was Barbara's hand-picked specialist, the one who had confidently dismissed my early symptoms of fatigue and nausea as natural aging. I ripped the medical tape away. The needle slid out of my skin, pulling a trail of warm blood that trickled down my knuckles and stained the crisp white hospital sheets. I pressed a trembling thumb against the puncture wound, breathing heavily through my nose. The monitor beside me registered the sudden spike in my heart rate and began to beep faster, a warning siren building in volume. I reached up my arm, shaking violently, and clamped my hand over the speaker. I found the power switch on the back of the machine and killed the monitor entirely, before it could alert the nurse's station at the end of the hall. Silence returned to the room. I rolled my heavy legs over the edge of the bed. The cold floor sent a shockwave up my spine. My knees buckled instantly, but I caught myself against the metal bed frame, biting my lip to keep from crying out in pain. I was weak, I was poisoned, and I was officially dying on paper, but my mind was rapidly sharpening into a lethal weapon. I needed an ally. I could not call my board of directors, and I certainly could not call the police because Barbara held my absolute medical power of attorney. In the eyes of the law, I was a confused, dying old man, and she was my legal voice. If I called the authorities, Keller would simply sedate me, and Barbara would have a judge declare me incompetent before the sun went down. I needed someone entirely off the grid. I shuffled, dragging my feet toward the small guest closet where they had hung the clothes I arrived in. Hidden in the inner lining of my worn leather jacket was a prepaid burner phone. In the high-stakes logistics business, you always keep a secure, untraceable line for emergencies. I pulled it out, my fingers fumbling clumsily as I punched in a number I had memorized years ago. The line rang twice before a deep, steady voice answered. It was Leo Reynolds. To the rest of the world, and to my wife, Leo was just the quiet 28-year-old groundskeeper who meticulously maintained the gardens of my massive estate. What Barbara did not know was that I had seen raw, hungry brilliance in the kid 5 years ago and secretly paid his tuition for a degree in forensic accounting. He was my hidden asset. He was loyal to me and only to me. Leo Ho. I whispered, my voice incredibly raspy and weak. It is Lawrence. They are poisoning me. I am in the VIP suite at City General. Bring a wheelchair. Bring plain clothes. Get me out of here right now. Help me do this, and you will never have to work a day in your life again. There was a tense pause, a sharp intake of breath over the line, and then a calm professional response. Give me exactly 15 minutes, Mr. Bennett. Stay out of sight. I hung up the phone and slipped it into the deep pocket of my hospital gown. The next 15 minutes were a brutal test of endurance. I dragged my failing body into the small private bathroom attached to the suite and locked the door behind me. I leaned heavily against the cool porcelain sink, turning on the faucet and splashing freezing water onto my face. I stared at the pale, hollowed-out version of myself in the mirror. My skin had a grayish, sickly tint. My eyes were deeply sunken, framed by dark purple bags. The heavy metals they were feeding me were doing their job flawlessly. But behind the exhaustion, a dangerous, calculating focus returned to my eyes. I was going to dismantle their entire world, brick by brick. A soft, rhythmic knock on the bathroom door pulled me back to reality. Mr. Bennett, a low voice called out. It is Leo. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. Leo stood there, wearing a dark, oversized hoodie, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, holding a pair of gray sweatpants, a dark sweater, and a plain winter coat. Positioned right next to him was a standard hospital transport wheelchair he must have swiped from the lobby. He did not ask any panicked questions. He did not offer any useless pity or shock. He simply handed me the clothes and helped support my shivering body as I dressed. We need to move fast, Leo whispered, kneeling to adjust the metal footrests on the wheelchair. The shift change for the nursing staff is in exactly 5 minutes. The halls will be busy, chaotic, but everyone will be distracted. I sank heavily into the leather seat of the wheelchair, pulling the baseball cap low over my face and burying my chin deep into the collar of the winter coat. Leo pushed me out of the suite, his movements remarkably smooth and casual. He looked exactly like a dutiful, tired nephew, taking his sick uncle down to the cafeteria for a change of scenery. We glided down the pristine, brightly lit hallway, the rubber wheels squeaking softly against the polished linoleum. My heart hammered aggressively against my ribs, threatening to give out. Every nurse or orderly that walked past us felt like a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. A woman in blue scrubs glanced our way, smiled politely at Leo, and kept walking toward the supply room. We were merely 10 feet away from the service elevator. The digital red numbers above the metal doors ticked down agonizingly slowly. 5, 4, 3. Just as the heavy metal doors slid open with a soft announcing chime, a voice echoed sharply from the other end of the long corridor. It was Dr. Simon Keller. He was holding a medical chart, walking briskly toward my room, his cell phone pressed tightly to his ear. "Yes, Barbara, I am going to check his vitals right now," I heard him say, his confident voice echoing off the tiled walls. "The dosage has been adjusted just as we agreed last night. He should not wake up again." He paused his walking, turning his head slightly in our direction. Leo did not hesitate. He pushed the wheelchair straight into the elevator, pivoting his body to completely shield me from Keller's direct line of sight. He reached out and slammed his hand against the button for the basement parking garage. The metal doors began to close, moving at a torturous, creeping pace. Through the narrowing gap, I watched Keller reach the door of my VIP suite. He pushed the door open, stepping inside. I watched his posture stiffen violently as he looked at the empty bed, the disconnected monitors, and the blood-stained sheets left behind. The elevator doors clicked shut just as Keller dropped his clipboard to the floor and lunged back into the hallway toward the emergency alarm. A piercing, high-pitched siren instantly began to wail overhead, vibrating violently through the concrete elevator shaft. "We are made," Leo said, his voice tight but completely controlled. He slammed his hand against the emergency stop button for a fraction of a second, pulled a small silver master key from his pocket, and shoved it into the maintenance panel. He overrode the elevator's programming to bypass the main lobby floor entirely, dropping us straight down into the underground loading dock. "We have a 3-minute head start," Leo stated, pushing my wheelchair aggressively out into the damp, freezing concrete parking garage. "My unmarked utility van is parked right by the loading bay. Hospital security will lock down the perimeter exits in 2 minutes." The security siren blared louder, echoing relentlessly through the massive concrete pillars of the garage. I gripped the plastic armrests of the wheelchair, my knuckles turning white. I was legally dead in 48 hours. I had absolutely no access to my massive fortune. A lethal toxin was actively coursing through my veins, and my treacherous wife was likely already preparing to auction off my life's work. But as Leo hoisted me up from the chair and threw me into the passenger seat of the rusted utility van, slamming the heavy metal door shut behind me, I did not feel like a dying man anymore. I felt like a ghost. And ghosts do not leave this earth until they have finished haunting the people who put them in the ground. The rusted utility van tore through the slick city streets, dodging the harsh glare of the streetlights. Every bump in the uneven road sent a violent shockwave of agony through my failing kidneys. I leaned my heavy head against the cold passenger window, fighting the intense urge to vomit. My vision blurred, doubling the bright red taillights of the cars ahead of us. Beside me, Leo drove with the icy calm of a seasoned operative. He kept his eyes locked on the road, taking erratic turns through dark industrial alleys to shake off any impossible pursuit. He did not speak a single word. I did not have the breath to ask questions. I just focused on keeping my lungs pulling in the damp air. We finally rolled to a stop inside a cavernous, pitch-black structure. Leo killed the engine. The heavy steel garage doors rolled shut behind us with a loud, definitive clang, sealing us off from the world. As my eyes adjusted to the dark, the dim emergency lights flickered on. We were inside Warehouse 47. On paper, this massive logistics hub at the industrial edge of the city had been decommissioned and sold 5 years ago. In reality, I kept it completely off the books, a ghost asset hiding in a complex maze of shell corporations. You learn very early in the freight business that you always need a secure place to disappear when the unions or the regulators squeeze too hard. Leo hurried around the front of the van, pulling open my heavy door and lifting me out with surprising strength. He practically carried me toward a small enclosed supervisor office in the back corner of the dusty warehouse. As he laid me down gently on a worn leather couch, I watched him move. To my wife, Barbara, Leo was nothing more than the uneducated kid who trimmed the hedges and skimmed the pool. She treated him like invisible background noise. That was her fatal mistake. 5 years ago, I caught a 23-year-old landscaper sitting in his work truck during his lunch break, effortlessly solving complex, algorithmic tax puzzles on a cracked laptop. I saw a hungry, raw brilliance in him that reminded me of myself at that exact age. I did not just hire a gardener. I quietly paid his full tuition for a master's degree in forensic accounting. I gave him the keys to the deepest vaults of my corporate architecture. I armed him, and right now, he was the only loyal soldier I had left. "I need you to stay conscious, Mr. Bennett," Leo said, his voice echoing slightly in the empty office. He pulled a thick wool blanket from a storage bin and draped it over my shivering body. I made the call from a secure line on the way over. He is exactly 3 minutes away. I nodded weakly, entirely unable to form coherent words. The poison was actively shutting down my nervous system. A creeping numbness traveled up my legs, and my chest felt like it was wrapped in tight iron bonds. I closed my eyes, picturing Barbara smiling at my hospital bedside. That image, that sickeningly sweet smile as she counted down the hours to my death, acted like a defibrillator to my fading heart. Anger is a remarkably effective fuel for survival. The heavy metal door of the office groaned open. A tall, disheveled man carrying a bulky black medical case rushed into the room. It was Dr. Stephen Hughes. 10 years ago, Stephen was the chief medical officer for my entire freight company, handling hundreds of injury claims and occupational hazards. He was brilliant, but an ugly divorce and a subsequent spiral into underground gambling had cost him his pristine reputation in the medical community. I covered his massive debts when the loan sharks came collecting, and I kept him out of federal prison. He owed me his life. Now I was calling in the debt. Stephen did not waste time with pleasantries. He took one look at my pale, sweating face and dropped his heavy bag onto the coffee table. He pulled out a portable centrifuge, a blood pressure cuff, and a series of glass vials. "You look like a corpse," Lawrence Stephen muttered, tying a rubber tourniquet tight around my bicep. He found a viable vein and drew a large vial of dark, sluggish blood. "I am trying to avoid that exact job description," I rasped, my voice sounding like crushed gravel. Stephen popped the vial into his portable machine and turned to examine my eyes with a harsh penlight. "Your pupils are incredibly sluggish. Your pulse is erratic and weak." "What exactly did you ingest?" he demanded, checking my reflexes. I told him about the nightly herbal detox teas Barbara had been feeding me for the past 6 months. I told him about the lingering metallic taste, the progressive physical weakness, the constant nausea that Dr. Keller had confidently dismissed as natural cardiac decay. Stephen cursed under his breath, rummaging frantically through his medical bag. He pulled out several large syringes and thick glass bottles of clear liquid. The machine on the table beeped loudly. Stephen grabbed the digital readout, and his face instantly drained of color. "Thallium," he said, his voice dropping to a grim whisper. "It is an odorless, tasteless, heavy metal. It is commonly used in commercial rat poison. It causes slow, agonizing organ failure that perfectly mimics natural disease. A few more days of that tea, Lawrence, and your kidneys would have completely liquefied. Dr. Keller would have signed a death certificate for natural cardiac arrest, and your wife would be a very wealthy, grieving widow. I am giving you a massive dose of Prussian blue." Stephen continued, already injecting a bright blue liquid into a fresh IV bag he had hung from a rusty floor lamp. "It is a highly aggressive chelating agent. It will bind to the heavy metals in your bloodstream and force your body to excrete them safely. But I am not going to lie to you, old friend. This is going to hurt worse than the poison. He was not exaggerating. The moment the cool blue liquid hit my bloodstream, it felt like liquid fire was racing through my veins. I arched off the leather couch, a guttural groan escaping my dry lips. My muscles cramped violently. Leo grabbed my shoulders, holding me down against the violent, uncontrollable convulsions. I focused entirely on breathing, gripping the edge of the leather cushions until my fingernails threatened to snap. The physical agony was immense, but it paled in comparison to the psychological torment raging inside my head. As the fiery pain slowly began to recede into a dull, throbbing ache, the absolute reality of my situation settled over me like a suffocating, heavy blanket. I had spent a decade married to a woman who had meticulously planned my slow, agonizing murder. She had sat across from me at the dinner table, smiling, pouring poison into my cup, kissing me goodnight, and then casually waiting for my organs to rot. And Melanie, the stepdaughter I had generously put through the finest universities, was enthusiastically calling dibs on my classic cars before my heart had even stopped beating. I was nothing more than an ATM machine to them, a stubborn obstacle delaying their lavish inheritance. They did not just want me dead. They wanted me to suffer. They wanted me entirely erased. An hour passed in heavy silence. My breathing finally leveled out. The terrifying numbness in my legs began to recede, replaced by the painful prickle of returning circulation. The thallium was no longer actively killing me. I was stabilized. I opened my eyes and looked at Stephen, who was wiping exhausted sweat from his forehead with a sterile towel. "You will survive, Lawrence," Stephen said softly, packing away his medical tools. "But you need rest. Your body has been at war for months." "I do not have time for rest," I replied, my voice finally gaining a fraction of its normal booming resonance. I sat up slowly, pushing through the intense wave of nausea. Every movement was a grueling chore, but my mind was completely lucid for the first time in half a year. The chemical fog of the poison had lifted, leaving behind a cold, calculating rage. I looked over at Leo, who had pulled a sleek black laptop from his backpack and set it up on a metal folding desk in the corner of the room. "They think I am a confused, wandering old man," I said, staring at the glowing computer screen. "Leo, get into the primary corporate banking portal. We need to move the operational funds into the shadow accounts before Barbara figures out I am actually missing from the hospital." Leo nodded silently, his fingers flying rapidly across the keyboard. He expertly bypassed the standard security gateways accessing the financial heart of my massive freight empire. I watched the screen intently, preparing to systematically drain every dollar from the accounts my wife thought she was inheriting. But as the final loading screen resolved, Leo stopped typing. The silence in the room grew instantly heavy and dangerous. He slowly turned the laptop toward me, his expression tight with genuine warning. "We have a massive problem, Mr. Bennett," Leo said grimly, pointing at the bold red letters flashing across the center of the screen. The glowing red words on the screen reflected in Leo's dark eyes. "Account locked. Conservatorship pending." I stared at the message, feeling a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. I reached out with a trembling hand and pressed a key, hoping it was just a temporary glitch. The screen blinked, but the red text remained exactly where it was. It was a digital brick wall. Leo started typing frantically, opening new terminal windows and running back doors into the secondary corporate accounts. He checked the operational funds for the freight trucks. Locked. He checked the payroll accounts. Locked. He even checked the private offshore holding accounts I had set up decades ago. Every single one of them displayed the exact same error code. Barbara had not just panicked when she discovered my hospital bed empty. She had executed a perfectly timed legal strike. Leo pulled up the public court filing database, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He hacked into the municipal server to download the time-stamped documents. He read the text aloud, his voice devoid of emotion. "At 6 a.m, just 1 hour after we escaped the hospital, your wife filed an emergency ex parte motion with a state judge. She did not file a missing persons report. She did not call the police to find her dying husband. She handed the judge a stack of medical records signed by Dr. Simon Keller. I leaned closer to the screen, my chest aching with every shallow breath. "What did those records say?" I rasped. Leo swallowed hard before reading the summary. "The documents certify that you are suffering from severe late-stage dementia. They claim you are experiencing violent paranoid delusions. They state that you ripped out your life-saving medical equipment and fled the hospital in a state of deep psychosis. Dr. Keller signed a sworn affidavit declaring you an immediate danger to yourself and a wandering flight risk. Based on that medical testimony, the judge granted Barbara emergency medical and financial power of attorney. She has full conservatorship. The magnitude of the betrayal settled over me like a suffocating shroud. Conservatorship. It was the ultimate legal guillotine. In the eyes of the law, I was no longer a man. I was a child. I had absolutely no civil rights. I could not sign a contract. I could not hire an attorney. I could not access a single penny of the logistics empire I had spent 40 years building with my own two hands. If the police found me right now, they would not arrest Barbara for attempted murder. They would gently put me in the back of a squad car, wrap a blanket around my shoulders, and deliver me straight back to my loving wife. And once I was back inside that house, Barbara could legally authorize the doctors to pump me full of sedatives, lock me in a psychiatric ward, or simply turn off my life support. She had cut off my financial oxygen completely. I was a billionaire sitting in a dusty warehouse with absolutely $0 to my name. I could not buy a cup of coffee. I could not pay for a taxi. I was legally erased from existence. Morning light began to bleed through the grimy skylights high above us in the warehouse ceiling. The cold industrial space felt suddenly much smaller, like a steel cage closing in on me. I looked at my hands. They were pale, bruised from the intravenous lines and trembling slightly from the aggressive chelating treatment Stephen had administered. But the crippling weakness that had kept me trapped in that hospital bed was completely gone. The poison was being flushed from my system. My mind was clear, sharp, and humming with a violent, focused energy. "Barbara thinks she has won," I said, my voice gaining strength, echoing off the concrete walls. "She thinks she cut off the head of the snake. But she made one critical mistake. She underestimated how dirty I am willing to fight." Leo closed the laptop, looking at me with a mixture of concern and deep respect. "Mr. Bennett, we have no funds. The bank algorithms have frozen everything connected to your social security number. If we try to wire money to a defense attorney, the system will flag our location and send the authorities straight to this warehouse. We are completely blind and broke." I slowly stood up from the leather couch. My legs wobbled for a fraction of a second, but I locked my knees, forcing myself to stand tall. I walked over to a rusted filing cabinet in the corner of the office. Decades ago, when I was fighting ruthless transport unions and corrupt supply chain managers, I learned a very valuable lesson. Never trust the banks and always keep a ghost fund where no judge can ever find it. I pulled out a small, heavy metal lockbox from the bottom drawer. I punched in a 4-digit code and popped the lid open. Inside were neat, tightly banded stacks of crisp $100 bills, exactly $50,000 in untraceable cash. It was not enough to run a nationwide freight company, but it was more than enough to fund a war. I grabbed 2 stacks of bills and tossed them onto the desk next to Leo. "We are going to bleed her dry," I stated, my eyes locking onto his. "But we cannot fight a legal battle in the courtroom. If we walk into a courthouse right now, her conservatorship allows her to have me committed before I can even speak to a judge. We have to fight her in the shadows. We have to make her self-destruct." Leo nodded slowly, pocketing the cash. His brilliant mind was already running through the tactical possibilities. "Where do we start?" he asked. "We start by securing the deadliest lawyer in this city," I replied. "Not a friendly family attorney. We need a corporate shark who operates outside the conventional rules. We need a man who knows how to legally dismantle a conservatorship without ever stepping foot inside a courtroom." I knew exactly who to call. Douglas Pierce was a man feared by every board of directors on the Eastern Seaboard. He had successfully defended my company against massive antitrust lawsuits and hostile takeovers. He was ruthless, incredibly expensive, and utterly uncompromised. More importantly, he hated Barbara. He had warned me not to marry her 10 years ago, calling her a transparent gold digger. I should have listened to him. Now I needed him to help me burn her world to ashes. But reaching Douglas was going to be complicated. Barbara was not stupid. If she had locked down my bank accounts, she was undoubtedly monitoring my primary business contacts. She would have instructed her own lawyers to watch Douglas closely. If Leo simply called his office, it would trigger a massive red flag. We needed to communicate with him entirely off the grid. I paced the small office, my mind racing through the logistics. I turned to Leo. You are going to have to deliver a message to Douglas personally. He plays golf every Tuesday morning at a private country club outside the city limits. You are going to bypass the security gates, walk right onto the green, and hand him a specific document. What document? Leo asked, opening a new encrypted file on his computer. A full, irrevocable transfer of my controlling shares, I answered. We are going to draft a document right now that moves my entire majority stake in the freight empire into a blind trust. And we are naming you as the sole executor of that trust. Leo froze his hands, hovering over the keyboard. Mr. Bennett, you are talking about billions of dollars in assets. If you sign that over to me, Barbara will not be able to touch the company. But it also means I control your entire life's work. I looked at the young man who had just risked his freedom to smuggle me out of a hospital. I trust you, Leo, I said firmly, more than I trust my own wife. And more importantly, Barbara's conservatorship only applies to assets held in my direct name. If the company is legally controlled by a blind trust managed by a third party, her emergency court order becomes completely worthless. She will have the keys to a kingdom that no longer exists. Leo smiled, a sharp, predatory grin that told me he understood the absolute brilliance of the maneuver. He began typing furiously, drafting the complex legal documents we would need Douglas to certify. Outside the warehouse, the morning sun climbed higher into the sky. The city was waking up. Somewhere across town, Barbara was likely sitting in my massive estate, sipping expensive coffee and celebrating her absolute victory. She believed she had executed a flawless plan. She believed I was a broken, dying man wandering the streets without a penny to my name. She had no idea that she had just forced me to become the most dangerous version of myself. I was no longer a husband. I was a ghost with a loaded weapon, and I was coming to take back everything that belonged to me. Make sure you print 2 copies of that trust, I told Leo, staring at the cold, concrete walls of the warehouse. Because once Douglas signs off on this, we are going out hunting. I stared at the digital clock mounted on the far wall of the dusty warehouse office. The glowing red numbers read 8:15 in the morning. The rhythmic hum of the city waking up outside felt like a distant memory. Inside this cold, concrete bunker, time was measured entirely by survival. In exactly 24 hours, the probate courts would open for their final Friday session. Barbara already held emergency medical control over my life, but she needed a secondary judicial stamp to completely breach the corporate firewall. Once a judge approved her final conservatorship petition, she would have unlimited access to my primary logistics holdings. She could liquidate my life work, dismantle the supply chain, and sell the pieces to my fiercest competitors. I had exactly 1 day to build a fortress she could not break. I paced the worn floorboards of the office, testing the limits of my poisoned body. The deep, agonizing ache in my joints was slowly fading into a manageable throb. The aggressive medical treatment Stephen had administered was working, pulling the heavy metals from my blood. I forced my legs to carry my weight, refusing to let the weakness win. Decades ago, when I was running my first fleet of 12 rusted trucks out of a dirt lot, I learned a brutal lesson about control. The banks think they own the money, and the dispatchers think they own the routes. But true power always lies in the blind spots. If you know how the machine operates, you know exactly where the cameras are not looking. Barbara was relying on expensive lawyers and polite judges to hand her my empire on a silver platter. She was playing by the rules of a civilized society. I was going to drag her into the dark. The heavy metal side door rattled violently, pulling my attention away from the clock. Leo slipped inside, bringing a rush of freezing morning air with him. He tossed a thick manila envelope onto the metal desk and pulled off his baseball cap. His breathing was heavy, but his eyes were bright with a fierce, victorious energy. Douglas signed it, Leo said, dropping his keys onto the table. He did not ask any unnecessary questions. I walked right onto the 6th hole of the golf course, handed him the paperwork, and told him you needed a favor. He took one look at the blind trust transfer, realized exactly what was happening, and signed his name on the dotted line. He also told me to give you a message. He said he always knew your wife was a venomous snake, and he is ready to help you cut off her head. A grim, genuine smile touched my lips. Douglas Pierce was an absolute shark in the courtroom, and sharks always smell blood in the water. But securing his signature on the legal documents was only the first step. Now we needed to execute the transfer digitally before Barbara and her legal team realized what we were doing. I sat down heavily in the leather chair beside Leo as he booted up his laptop. We cannot simply push a transfer of this magnitude through the main corporate server, I explained, watching the screen illuminate his focused face. Barbara has undoubtedly instructed her lawyers to set up automated alerts on all my accounts. The very second they see a massive shift in controlling shares, they will file an immediate injunction to freeze the entire network. The courts will lock everything down until a judge reviews the transaction. We need to bury this transfer in an absolute avalanche of digital noise. Leo cracked his knuckles, a familiar glint of adrenaline shining in his dark eyes. You want a smokescreen? He murmured, his fingers hovering expertly over the keyboard. I can bounce the operational requests through our international shipping terminals. If I generate a few thousand automated freight invoices across the European and Asian servers simultaneously, I can hide the share transfer deep inside a routine data migration. To anyone watching the main portal, it will just look like a standard quarterly server backup. Do it, I ordered, my voice hard and steady. The warehouse fell completely silent, except for the frantic rhythmic tapping of Leo typing on the keyboard. I watched the progress bar appear on the screen. It was a torturously slow crawl. Every percentage point felt like an hour draining away from my life. My heart pounded aggressively against my ribs. If Barbara and her lawyers caught the data spike, they could terminate the server connection and lock us out permanently. We were two men sitting in a dark, abandoned warehouse, fighting a high-stakes digital war against a highly paid legal army. The progress bar crept to 80%, then 90%. The screen flashed briefly, freezing for a fraction of a second that made my stomach drop. Leo did not blink. He typed in a rapid sequence of override commands, pushing the data through a secondary backdoor he had built years ago during his forensic accounting training. The screen blinked green. A tiny confirmation message popped up in the corner of the monitor. The shares were successfully transferred. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 24 hours. The blind trust was officially active. Leo was now the sole legal executor of my multi-billion-dollar logistics empire. Because the assets were no longer held in my direct personal name, Barbara and her emergency court order were completely worthless against the company. She had the keys to a kingdom that no longer legally existed. We secured the company, Leo said, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his tired eyes. But we still have a massive vulnerability. Barbara still controls your personal estate. She has the mansion, the private bank accounts, the vintage cars, and the art collection. She does not know she lost the main prize yet, but she knows you are missing. And she knows she needs liquid cash to pay off the doctors and lawyers helping her execute this fraud. I nodded slowly, staring at the cold, concrete floor. She is a desperate woman playing a dangerous game, I replied. And desperate people always make careless mistakes. She cannot access the corporate billions, so she is going to start selling off of the physical assets sitting right in front of her. She will try to liquidate my life from the inside out. I reached over and picked up the stack of untraceable $100 bills I had pulled from the safe earlier. We have stripped her of the big win, I said, handing a bundle of cash to Leo. Now we are going to use her own greed against her. We are going to let her think she is getting away with it. We need eyes and ears inside that house. I need to know exactly who she is talking to and what she is planning to sell first. Leo pocketed the money, his expression hardening into pure determination. I can get back onto the estate grounds, he said quietly. The landscaping crew is scheduled to clear the dead brush near the back patio this afternoon. Barbara ignores the hired help. I can slip inside the main study and the living room through the terrace doors. I can plant the hidden microphones we keep in the security lockbox. It was incredibly risky. If Melanie or Barbara caught him inside the house, they would call the police immediately, and our entire ghost operation would be exposed. But we needed that audio feed to intercept their next move. We were fighting a shadow war, and information was our most lethal weapon. I looked at the young man who had saved my life, trusting him completely. Get in, plant the bugs, and get out, I told him. The clock is still ticking, and I want to hear every single lie my wife tells before we burn her world to the ground. The air inside the warehouse felt thick with the electric charge of impending war. We had secured the digital assets, but the legal battlefield was still a minefield of vulnerabilities. Barbara held the emergency medical power of attorney. That piece of paper was a loaded gun pointed directly at my head. If she convinced the probate judge to finalize the conservatorship, she could authorize a police manhunt to drag me back to a psychiatric ward. I needed to shatter her legal authority before she even knew she was in a fight. I needed to summon the shark. I sat down at the metal folding table and instructed Leo to establish a heavily encrypted video link. I gave him a string of numbers that bypassed standard servers, routing directly to the private secure terminal of Douglas Pierce. Douglas was the most feared corporate attorney on the eastern seaboard. He did not just practice law, he weaponized it. For 2 decades, he had crushed hostile takeovers and buried rival executives in mountains of impenetrable litigation. When I married Barbara 10 years ago, Douglas had refused to attend the wedding. He told me flat out that she was a venomous parasite. I had ignored him then. I was not going to ignore him now. The laptop screen flickered and resolved into a crisp, high-definition image. Douglas sat in his mahogany-paneled office wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit. His silver hair was slicked back, and his piercing gray eyes locked onto the camera. He looked at my pale, bruised face and the grim surroundings of the warehouse. He did not offer any useless sympathy. He simply leaned forward, resting his hands on his massive desk. "You look terrible, Lawrence," Douglas said, his voice smooth and deadly calm. "But considering your wife told the entire legal community you were suffering a terminal psychotic break, I am glad to see your brain is still functioning." I smiled weakly. I told him that I was poisoned, not crazy, and that we had a very narrow window to completely dismantle her legal authority. I explained that Leo had initiated the digital transfer of the corporate shares into the blind trust, but we needed the absolute legal finality that only a shark like Douglas could provide. I needed a complete, irrevocable revocation of Barbara's medical and financial power of attorney, and I needed it filed in absolute secrecy. Douglas nodded slowly, picking up a gold fountain pen. He explained that Barbara had hired a highly aggressive boutique law firm. They were currently petitioning the probate judge to fast-track the final conservatorship signature by tomorrow morning. If they succeeded, any standard legal countermove I made would be immediately flagged and tied up in endless injunctions. They would argue that I was not of sound mind to sign a revocation. "We cannot fight them in the open light of the courtroom," Douglas stated flatly. "If I walk into the courthouse today and file a public revocation, her lawyers will trigger an automatic legal hold. They will demand a psychological evaluation, which means pulling you out of hiding. We have to file this under the radar. We will use a proxy docket." I listened closely as Douglas outlined the strategy. He would draft the revocation documents immediately. Instead of filing them in the main city registry, he would route them through a subsidiary shadow court in a neighboring county where he had a trusted judge in his pocket. The paperwork would be completely legally binding, time-stamped, and securely sealed. Barbara and her legal team would not receive any digital notifications. They would continue to operate under the absolute delusion that their emergency power of attorney was still active. They would walk into their final hearing tomorrow, believing they held all the cards, completely unaware that their legal authority had already been quietly executed in the dark. But there was a catch. Douglas leaned closer to the camera, his expression dead serious. "Lawrence," he said, "for this to be bulletproof, I need a sworn statement of medical competency attached to the revocation. I need an official signature from a licensed physician stating that your mind is totally sound, completely disproving the dementia narrative that Dr. Keller fabricated." I looked over at Stephen, the underground toxicologist, who had saved my life just hours ago. Stephen was pacing near the back of the office, nervously rubbing the back of his neck. He was a brilliant doctor, but his license had been suspended years ago due to his gambling debts. His signature on a legal competency document would not hold up against Barbara's high-paid legal team. We needed a clean, undeniable medical authority. I turned back to the screen and looked Douglas right in the eye. I told him to draft the revocation anyway. I promised him that by the time the sun went down, I would have a signed competency affidavit from the very same doctor who tried to condemn me. I was going to break Dr. Simon Keller, and I was going to force him to legally certify my sanity. Douglas let out a low, appreciative chuckle. He loved a brutal strategy. He told Leo to prepare the secure printer in the warehouse. Within minutes, the heavy legal documents began to print out, page by page, forming a stack of crisp white paper on the metal desk. These were the weapons of my liberation. As the printer whirred, Douglas addressed Leo directly. He told the young man that managing a blind trust of this magnitude required absolute precision. The moment Barbara realized the corporate billions were gone, she would hire forensic investigators to track the money. Leo would be stepping into the crosshairs of a massive financial war. I watched Leo carefully. The kid did not flinch. He looked at the screen and told Douglas that he had spent the last 5 years studying every single vulnerability in the modern banking system. He promised that Barbara would not find a single dime. Douglas nodded in approval. He told me he would have his private couriers standing by to retrieve the signed documents. We had to move with absolute stealth. One wrong move, one intercepted communication, and Barbara would realize I was building a counteroffensive. The secrecy was paramount. I disconnected the video call and picked up a pen. I carefully read through the dense legal language Douglas had drafted. Every paragraph was a meticulously designed trap. I flipped to the final page and signed my name with a steady, forceful hand. I was legally severing my wife from my life, my health, and my wealth. I slid the papers into a thick envelope and handed them to Leo. The corporate empire was safe in the trust. The legal revocation was drafted and ready to be buried in the shadow courts. But my personal estate was still actively bleeding. Barbara still had the keys to my mansion, the titles to my vehicles, and access to my personal checking accounts. I knew her boundless greed would not let her sit still. She would want to celebrate her impending victory by spending my money. I told Leo it was time for him to go back to the estate. We needed those hidden microphones planted in the mansion immediately. I needed to hear Barbara's voice. I needed to listen to her arrogant plotting, because the more comfortable she felt, the more careless she would become. Leo grabbed his landscaping gear and headed for the utility van. The real war was no longer about survival. It was about systematic, absolute annihilation. And the clock was ticking down to 0. The silence of the cold concrete warehouse was abruptly shattered by a sharp melodic chime coming from the laptop. Leo stopped packing his landscaping gear and rushed back to the folding table. He tapped a single key and the screen flooded with a cascade of scrolling data. A grim smile spread across his face. "She hit the wall," Leo announced, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Your wife just tried to execute a massive wire transfer from the primary corporate holding account to her personal offshore trust. The system automatically rejected it. She tried 3 more times using the emergency power of attorney credentials. Every single attempt bounced back with a fatal error. The blind trust held strong. She is completely locked out of the billions." I leaned against the rusted filing cabinet, feeling a dark, profound satisfaction settle into my bones. I closed my eyes and pictured the exact look of absolute panic washing over Barbara's perfectly manicured face. She had spent 10 years playing the devoted, loving wife waiting for the massive payday. She had hired expensive lawyers, bribed doctors, and poisoned my tea, all to secure the keys to the kingdom. And now, standing at the gates, she realized the castle was completely empty. But I knew my wife better than she knew herself. Barbara was a parasite, and when a parasite is severed from its primary host, it immediately begins frantically searching for another source of blood. She needed liquid cash, and she needed it immediately. She had to pay off her boutique law firm to finalize the conservatorship, and she had to pay Dr. Keller his extortion money to keep my fake medical records intact. With the corporate bank accounts wrapped in impenetrable legal red tape, she was going to have to pivot. She was going to have to sell the things she could physically touch. Another alert chimed on the laptop. Leo leaned closer to the monitor, his eyes tracking a sudden spike in digital activity originating from the mansion's private network. "It is not Barbara this time," Leo murmured, his fingers flying across the keys to intercept the data packets. "It is your stepdaughter." Melanie's personal laptop just established a connection with a high-end, unregulated luxury auction site. She is moving extremely fast. I walked over and looked over his shoulder. The screen mirrored exactly what Melanie was typing in the comfort of my own study. She was uploading photographs. First, a series of glossy images of my 1969 Shelby GT 500, the very same car she had enthusiastically claimed while standing over my supposed deathbed. My chest tightened. I had bought that car 40 years ago with the very first substantial paycheck my logistics company ever earned. It was a symbol of my blood, sweat, and survival. "Look at the asking price," Leo said, shaking his head in disbelief. "She is listing a pristine classic car worth well over $250,000 for a fraction of its value. She set a buy it now price of $80,000, demanding immediate wire transfer. It is a complete fire sale." "She is not done," I replied, watching a new set of images upload to a rapid real estate liquidation portal. Melanie was listing the timber-framed cabin I owned up in the Blue Ridge Mountains. It was my private sanctuary, a quiet place completely isolated from the brutal corporate world, a place I had intended to eventually leave to a land conservation trust. She was pricing the massive estate like a desperate yard sale, slashing the value just to guarantee a cash buyer by tomorrow morning. "They are panicking," I said, my voice cold and steady. "The sudden lack of access to the corporate accounts has them terrified. They need cash by Friday to pay off the doctor and the lawyers. Melanie is trying to liquidate the physical assets before the probate judge even signs the final conservatorship papers. It is highly illegal, and it is incredibly stupid." Leo tapped the screen, a predatory gleam in his eyes. "And her stupidity just handed us the exact weapon we need." In her frantic rush to secure the cash, Melanie completely bypassed the secure family brokers. She did not use the encrypted estate accounts. She registered the auction listings using her own personal email address, and she linked the payout routing numbers directly to her private checking account. I looked at Leo, understanding exactly what he meant. By trying to personally pocket the cash from the stolen assets, Melanie had ripped a massive hole in their security. She had left a glaring, undeniable digital footprint linking her directly to the fraudulent sale of my property. "Can you track the buyer for the Shelby?" I asked. Leo nodded confidently. "The auction site she is using is notorious for its weak security protocols. I am already inside their back end. The moment a buyer clicks that purchase button and initiates communication, I will have their name, their location, and their contact information. Do not block the sale." I instructed, a new ruthless plan forming in my mind. "Let the listing go live. Let her think she has successfully found a buyer. She wants to sell my car for quick cash. We are going to let her hand the keys over. But we are going to make absolutely certain that the transaction blows up spectacularly in her face." I walked away from the screen, feeling the adrenaline burn away the last lingering aches of the poison in my blood. Melanie's reckless greed had just given us our first point of attack. She thought she was outsmarting a dying old man. She had no idea she was leaving a trail of digital breadcrumbs leading straight to her own destruction. I turned back to Leo. "Finish monitoring her network, and then get your gear." We know they are distracted, panicking over the money. It is the perfect time for you to get onto the estate grounds. Plant the microphones in the study just like we planned. I want to hear the exact moment they realize their empire of lies is crumbling beneath their feet. I watched the heavy steel doors of the warehouse roll up to let the afternoon light spill over the cracked concrete floor. Leo climbed into his battered green landscaping truck and turned the ignition. The engine rumbled with a rough, uneven sound. The vehicle was a perfect disguise and a masterpiece of invisibility. For 5 years, my wife and her daughter had treated that truck and the man driving it as nothing more than background scenery. They never looked twice at him, and they never asked him a single question about his life. That boundless arrogance was about to become their ultimate downfall. I gave him a curt nod from the shadows of the office. He threw the truck into gear and drove out into the daylight, carrying the exact tools we needed to tear down their kingdom of lies. I stayed behind in the cold warehouse, monitoring the encrypted tracking software Leo had left running on the laptop. A small, blinking blue dot mapped his progress across the city grid. 20 minutes later, the dot stopped at the gilded front gates of my estate. I knew the security protocol intimately because I had designed it myself. The private guards at the gatehouse recognized his truck immediately. They waved him through without a second thought or a single glance in the back of his vehicle. To them, he was just Leo, the quiet kid who trimmed the topiary and maintained the complex irrigation systems. They had no idea they had just opened the front door for a forensic accountant armed with military-grade surveillance equipment. From the safety of this warehouse, I listened to the live audio feed Leo had activated on his secure phone. The connection was crystal clear. I could hear the crunch of gravel under his heavy work boots as he walked around the perimeter of the massive stone mansion. He moved deliberately toward the back terrace. The tall glass French doors leading directly into my private study were notoriously tricky to open. I had specifically requested them to look elegant, but operate with a highly complex locking mechanism. I had taught Leo how to bypass them years ago, long before I ever suspected my own wife was trying to murder me. I heard a soft metallic click over the audio feed, followed by the smooth slide of hinges. The door swung open, and Leo was officially inside the house. The study was the absolute nerve center of the estate. It was the room where Barbara would inevitably hold her secret meetings with her high-priced lawyers. It was the room where Melanie would sit at my desk and furiously calculate her stolen profits. Leo moved with absolute silence. Over the open line, I heard the faint rustle of his jacket. He was planting the first microtransmitter. He secured it beneath the heavy mahogany desk, pressing the powerful adhesive back against the raw wood, where no cleaning staff would ever run a dusting cloth. The second transmitter went behind the massive stone fireplace wedged deeply between the decorative brickwork and the solid oak mantel. We just needed one more device positioned near the center seating area to capture their whispered conversations perfectly. Suddenly, the heavy wooden door connecting the study to the main hallway rattled loudly. The brass handle turned with a violent twist. Someone was coming in. My heart slammed aggressively against my ribs. I leaned closer to the laptop speaker, holding my breath in the dark warehouse. The door swung wide open. The sharp, rapid clicking of expensive high heels echoed fiercely across the polished hardwood floor. It was Melanie. She was loudly complaining on her cell phone, and her voice was dripping with absolute irritation. She was telling the person on the other end of the line that the estate auction house was trying to charge too high a commission on the classic cars. She demanded that the broker lower their fee because she needed the liquid cash by the end of the week. Then her footsteps stopped abruptly. Her voice hitched in her throat. She demanded to know who was in the room, her tone shifting instantly from minor irritation to sharp, aggressive suspicion. She asked what he was doing creeping around in her stepfather's private office. I gripped the edge of the metal folding table, waiting for the inevitable disaster to unfold. If she panicked and called the estate security guards, Leo would be arrested for trespassing immediately. The police would search his bag, find the surveillance equipment, and the entire shadow operation would collapse before it even began. But Leo did not panic. He did not freeze like a criminal caught in the act. He leaned perfectly into the ignorant disguise she had forced upon him for 5 years. He played the absolute fool. I heard the distinctive metallic snap of a tape measure retracting. Leo spoke up, and his voice sounded entirely calm, submissive, and perfectly confused. He apologized profusely to Miss Melanie. He explained that he was simply checking the moisture sensors on the terrace planters outside. He told her that the weather stripping on the bottom of the French doors was completely rotted out, and that water was leaking right onto the expensive hardwood floor. He said Mr. Bennett had specifically asked him to measure the doorframe for a replacement seal last week, before his health took a turn for the worse. He added that he was just trying to finish the maintenance job he was given so the floors would not warp. It was a brilliant and flawless lie. It played directly into her absolute certainty that she was the smartest person in any room she walked into. It also capitalized perfectly on her newly assumed ownership of the estate. She certainly did not want costly water damage ruining the hardwood floors she was currently planning to sell to the highest bidder. I listened closely as Melanie let out a heavy, dramatic sigh of profound annoyance. She snapped at him, saying that he had scared her half to death, creeping around in the shadows. The sheer arrogance in her voice was thick and unfiltered. She told him that Lawrence was never coming back to the house and that he did not need to measure anything at all. In fact, she insisted that he did not need to be anywhere near the inside of the mansion. She ordered him to grab his dirty tools and get back outside where he belonged. She stated that they were going to be selling the property very soon anyway, so he should not start any new repair projects. She told him to just keep the front lawn looking decent for the real estate photographers, and then she demanded that he get out of her sight immediately. Leo replied with a soft, polite apology. He promised he was leaving right that second. I heard the slow, heavy footsteps of his work boots retreating across the room. I heard the French doors pull shut with a solid click. A moment later, the familiar crunch of gravel returned over the audio feed. He was safely back outside in the daylight. I let out a long, shuddering breath in the cold warehouse. My hands were shaking slightly from the massive surge of adrenaline. Leo had successfully planted the listening devices right under her nose. Melanie truly thought she had just reprimanded a lazy, uneducated gardener who had wandered too far from the bushes. She had absolutely no idea that the quiet man in the dirt-stained jeans had just hardwired her entire world for complete destruction. I smiled in the darkness of the office. The Trojan horse was securely inside the gates. They were going to sit in my house, drink my wine, and openly plot my demise while I listened to every single word. The digital trap was fully set, and now we just had to wait for the rats to start talking. The heavy steel doors of the warehouse groaned upward just enough to let Leo and his rusted landscaping truck slip back into the shadows. He killed the engine and stepped out onto the cracked concrete carrying his canvas backpacks like it held a live explosive. He walked straight to the folding metal table, unzipped the bag, and pulled out a sleek black audio receiver. He plugged it directly into his laptop, connecting the hardware to the encrypted digital network he had established. I sat in the worn leather chair holding a steaming cup of black coffee in my steady hands. The aggressive blue liquid Stephen had pumped into my veins earlier was still doing its job, flushing the last toxic remnants of my wife and her lethal herbal tea from my system. My body was battered, but my mind was completely clear and razor-sharp. Leo flipped a small switch on the receiver. A soft, static hiss filled the empty office, followed immediately by the crystal-clear, rhythmic sound of a grandfather clock ticking. I knew that sound intimately. It was the antique mahogany clock standing in the corner of my private study at the estate. The microphones were perfectly positioned. We could hear the faint rustle of papers shifting on the desk, the low hum of the central air conditioning kicking on, and the distant muffled sound of Melanie complaining to one of the maids out in the hallway. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and stared at the small, blinking green light on the receiver. We were invisible ghosts haunting the very halls of my own house. 10 minutes passed in a tense, heavy silence. Then the thick oak doors of the study slammed shut with a violent thud. The sharp, rapid clicking of high heels paced frantically across the polished hardwood floor. It was Barbara. I could hear her ragged, shallow breathing over the audio feed. She was not the cool, calculated, and grieving widow she pretended to be in public. She was rapidly unraveling under the pressure of her own lies. A second set of footsteps echoed loudly in the room. They were heavier, uneven, and frantic. A man had entered the study, and he was completely out of breath. It was Dr. Simon Keller. He had bypassed the front security gate, likely using the private medical access code Barbara had provided him months ago when they first began plotting my demise. Keller did not bother with formal pleasantries. His voice was pitched incredibly high and trembled with raw, unfiltered panic. He demanded to know exactly what was going on. He told Barbara that the hospital administrators were actively reviewing his patient discharge logs because a billionaire VIP patient had vanished into thin air under his direct supervision. He explained that the hospital security team was currently pulling the surveillance tapes from the entire floor, and the legal department was preparing to formally involve the police. Barbara snapped back at him, her voice dripping with absolute venom. She ordered him to keep his voice down and to stop acting like a terrified child. She insisted that she had the emergency conservatorship finalized, that the probate judge had signed off on the severe dementia narrative, and that my sudden disappearance only proved their fabricated medical story was completely accurate. She told Keller to simply hold his nerve, go back to his office, and stick to the script they had meticulously rehearsed. But Keller was rapidly breaking under the immense pressure. I could hear the absolute desperation choking his words. He told her that a fake medical chart was one thing, but a missing billionaire was a massive federal liability. He stated that he did not sign up for a chaotic missing persons investigation and a potential murder charge. He said he only signed up for a quiet, natural expiration in a comfortable hospital bed. And then he dropped the ultimate hammer. Keller told her that he was completely done waiting for the estate to clear probate. He demanded his money immediately. He reminded Barbara that she had promised him $200,000 for falsifying the heavy metal toxicology reports and signing the psychological incompetence affidavit. He said he needed the cash by Friday afternoon, or he was going to walk straight into the central police station. He threatened to turn state's evidence, claiming Barbara had manipulated him and secretly poisoned her husband without his professional knowledge. He swore he would happily trade her freedom to secure his own legal immunity. The silence that fell over the study was deafening. When Barbara finally spoke, her voice was a low, dangerous hiss that sent a chill through the audio feed. She admitted to Keller that she could not access the primary corporate funds yet because the bank algorithms had temporarily locked the main accounts. She confessed that she was actively liquidating physical assets and selling off the classic cars just to generate the untraceable cash he was demanding. She told him to give her 48 hours. By Friday afternoon, she promised she would have a heavy duffel bag filled with $200,000 in unmarked bills. But she delivered a chilling warning. She told him that if he ever threatened her with the police again, she would make absolutely sure he went down to prison right alongside her. Keller let out a shaky, pathetic breath. Friday, he repeated, his voice echoing through the hidden microphones. Friday at 3 p.m. Have the cash ready. Barbara, or I promise I will burn this entire estate down to the ground. The heavy oak door opened and slammed shut again. Keller was gone. Barbara let out a long, frustrated scream of pure rage that distorted the audio receiver, followed instantly by the loud, explosive sound of a heavy glass tumbler smashing violently against the brick fireplace. Leo reached over and muted the receiver. He looked at me, his dark eyes wide with the sheer gravity of what we had just successfully captured. We had a pristine, unedited, recorded confession of extortion, medical fraud, and attempted murder. It was an absolute silver bullet. But I did not just want to hand a digital tape over to the local police. I wanted to break them from the inside out. I stood up from the leather chair, feeling the strength returning to my legs. The fatigue was entirely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating momentum. Dr. Keller just drew a massive target right on his own back, I said, staring at the dark screen of the laptop. He is terrified, greedy, and running entirely on blind panic. That makes him incredibly dangerous to Barbara, but it makes him extremely useful to us. Leo opened a new secure terminal window on his computer network. "You want me to track his location?" Leo asked, his fingers hovering over the keys. I shook my head slowly. "I do not just want to track him. I want to completely strip him of his leverage. Dr. Keller thinks he is going to walk away from my agonizing murder with a fat, comfortable retirement fund. I want you to deploy every tracing algorithm you have. I want you to locate every single private bank account, every hidden offshore asset, and every digital stash that corrupt doctor has ever opened. We are not waiting until Friday to make our move. We are going to bleed Dr. Simon Keller absolutely dry tonight." The glow of the laptop screen cast a pale blue light across the cold concrete walls of the warehouse. Leo typed with blinding speed, his fingers moving rhythmically across the keyboard as he hunted Dr. Simon Keller through the global financial network. I stood behind him, watching lines of code peel away the respectable facade of the man who had confidently condemned me to death. I had spent my entire life building a company that moved freight across impossible terrain, and I understood that every complex system has a structural vulnerability. For Dr. Simon Keller, that vulnerability was his overwhelming arrogance and his insatiable greed. He truly believed he could play God with my life and walk away completely untouched. I had learned decades ago in the logistics business that corrupt men always make the same predictable mistake. They build elaborate public lies, but they always hide their dirty money in places they believe are untouchable. Leo bypassed 3 separate banking firewalls in a matter of minutes. He accessed a highly encrypted offshore registry based in the Cayman Islands. Keller was not just a greedy physician taking a single payoff from my treacherous wife. He was a prolific white-collar criminal. The digital ledgers revealed a massive network of shell companies padded with over $4 million in illicit bribes from wealthy clients who needed quiet, unethical medical favors. "Drain it!" I commanded, my voice hard and entirely devoid of mercy. Leo initiated the transfer protocol, routing the illicit funds through a dozen international shadow accounts before dropping them into a secure digital void that only he controlled. I watched the numbers on the screen plummet. $4 million dropped to $2 million, then 500,000, then absolutely zero. Every single dime Keller had collected over a lifetime of medical malpractice vanished in the blink of an eye. I told Leo to prepare a blank digital tablet. We loaded a single screen onto the device. It was a live feed of Keller's primary offshore bank account, displaying a balance of $0 alongside a simple text message demanding the truth. We knew Keller's routine perfectly. After finishing his late hospital shift, he always retreated to his private luxury clinic downtown to review his illicit ledgers in peace. The security at his clinic was pathetic compared to the impenetrable logistics terminals I had built for my freight empire. The drive through the city was a blur of streetlights and dark intersections. Leo navigated the utility van with the precision of a seasoned operative. I sat in the passenger seat, clutching the blank tablet, feeling the weight of the coming confrontation. Every breath I took was a reminder of the poison my wife had fed me, but every exhale pushed the weakness further away. I was operating on a level of pure, calculated vengeance. When we arrived at the clinic, Leo bypassed the rear service door alarms in less than 30 seconds. The building was dark and completely empty. I walked down the carpeted hallway, feeling the smooth fabric of my tailored suit brushing against my arms. I felt no weakness. The aggressive blue liquid Stephen had pumped into my veins earlier had done its job, and unadulterated adrenaline carried me the rest of the way. I opened the heavy oak door to Keller's plush private office and placed the glowing tablet dead center on his pristine glass desk. Then I retreated to the deep shadows of the leather armchair in the corner of the room and waited. 10 minutes later, the heavy office door clicked open. The overhead lights flicked on with a sharp buzz. Dr. Simon Keller walked in looking exhausted and utterly terrified. He tossed his expensive leather briefcase onto a side chair and immediately froze when he saw the glowing tablet sitting on his desk. He approached it cautiously, like a man approaching a venomous snake. I watched from the darkness as his eyes darted to the screen. I watched the blood drain entirely from his face, leaving him as pale as a corpse. His hands began to shake violently as he picked up the tablet. He tapped the screen frantically, desperately, trying to refresh the page, refusing to believe the digital reality staring back at him. He let out a choked, pathetic gasp as his knees buckled slightly. "Refreshing the screen will not bring your retirement fund back, Simon," I said, my voice calm and completely steady, echoing through the quiet office. Keller whipped around, dropping the tablet onto the thick carpet. He stumbled backward against the wall, gasping for air, like a dying fish pulled from the water. He looked at me as if he were staring at an apparition. He stammered my name, unable to comprehend how the man he had condemned to a slow, agonizing death just 12 hours ago was sitting in his office wearing an expensive suit and breathing perfectly fine. "You are supposed to be dead," he whispered, his voice cracking with absolute terror. I stood up slowly and stepped out of the shadows into the harsh overhead light. I told him that I survived because I was built from something much harder than the fragile, wealthy socialites he was used to treating. I told him I did not come to kill him because he was going to be much more useful to me alive. I walked slowly across the room, closing the distance between us. Keller pressed his back flat against the wall, sweating profusely. I told him he had exactly two choices tonight. He could scream for the police right now, and I would happily hand the federal authorities the digital ledger proving he accepted bribes to forge medical records, resulting in decades inside a federal penitentiary. Or he could open the hidden safe I knew he kept behind the framed medical degrees on his wall and hand over my authentic, unedited toxicology reports. Keller tried to bargain. He begged me to understand that Barbara had threatened him, that she was a manipulative monster who had forced him into signing the psychological incompetence affidavit. He sobbed, claiming he was just a pawn in her grand scheme. I did not raise my voice. I took a final step closer, invading his personal space. I told him that his money was gone forever, and his medical license was currently hanging by a single microscopic thread. I demanded the real blood work. Keller broke completely. The arrogant doctor who had stood over my hospital bed dissolved into a weeping, pathetic mess. He fell to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. He crawled over to the oak bookshelf and pushed aside a framed diploma from a prestigious medical school. He spun the dial of a hidden wall safe with trembling, frantic fingers. The heavy metal door clicked open. He pulled out a thick red medical folder and handed it up to me without daring to make eye contact. I opened the folder and reviewed the documents. The authentic laboratory results were all there. The pages clearly documented the lethal levels of thallium in my bloodstream, proving beyond any shadow of a doubt that my organ failure was caused by heavy metal poisoning. It was the undeniable scientific proof of Barbara's attempted murder. Her entire medical alibi was officially destroyed. With this folder in my possession, her emergency conservatorship was nothing more than a piece of fraudulent garbage. I closed the folder and looked down at the weeping doctor on the floor. I told him that if he warned Barbara about this meeting, I would send the FBI a complete roadmap to his offshore accounts and a detailed list of his illicit clients before the sun came up. I told him to sit in his office and wait for my lawyers to call him. I walked out of the clinic, leaving him sobbing in the dark. The legal weapon I needed to destroy my wife was finally secure in my hands. The medical fraud was dismantled. Now it was time to hunt my greedy stepdaughter and expose the absolute depths of her financial desperation. I tossed the thick red medical folder onto the metal folding table inside the warehouse. The authentic blood work was securely in my possession. Barbara had officially lost her medical alibi. But my treacherous wife was only half of the disease infecting my life. It was time to amputate the other half. I turned my attention to the glowing computer monitor, where Leo had been meticulously tracking my stepdaughter. Melanie was moving fast. Her online auction for my vintage '69 Shelby had attracted exactly the kind of buyer you would expect for a heavily discounted classic car requiring an immediate cash wire. It was a local chop shop operator known for moving stolen luxury vehicles across state lines. Leo tapped the screen, bringing up a live global positioning map. She had arranged to meet him at a busy commercial plaza downtown in less than 20 minutes. Melanie truly believed she was stealing a simple antique. She had no idea that beneath the restored leather interior and the polished chrome exterior, I had retrofitted that car with the exact same military-grade security architecture I used to protect my commercial freight trucks. 30 years ago, I lost a convoy of expensive electronics to a coordinated highway hijacking. After that incident, I demanded absolute control over my assets. I personally designed a remote kill switch system that bypassed the engine computer entirely. It was hardwired directly into the fuel pump and the electronic door locks. I had quietly installed a prototype of that system into the Shelby. I told Leo to establish a direct uplink to the car security mainframe. A sleek control panel opened on his laptop screen, displaying the live engine telemetry of my vehicle. The engine was currently running. Melanie was driving the car toward the meeting point. I watched the digital speedometer fluctuate as she navigated the city streets, completely oblivious to the digital crosshairs aimed directly at her back. We accessed the city traffic cameras, tapping into the municipal feed to watch the transaction unfold in real time. The camera feed flickered to life, showing a crowded intersection bordering a sprawling shopping plaza. My beautiful vintage car pulled into a parking space. Melanie stepped out wearing designer sunglasses and holding a thick leather folder containing the forged title documents. A tall man in a dark jacket approached her carrying a heavy aluminum briefcase. They exchanged a few quick words. The buyer handed her the briefcase. Melanie opened it to verify the stacks of cash. She smiled a greedy, hollow smile and tossed him the keys. The buyer insisted on a quick test drive around the block to verify the engine before finalizing the exchange. He climbed into the driver's seat. Melanie confidently slid into the passenger seat, resting the briefcase full of cash on her lap. The buyer pulled the Shelby out of the parking lot and steered it toward the massive 4-lane intersection. I stared at the blinking green dot on the screen. I waited until the car was positioned exactly in the center of the busiest crosswalk in the district, surrounded by a seesaw of morning traffic. I commanded Leo to execute the override. Leo pressed the execute key. Through the traffic camera, I watched the heavy muscle car jerk violently to a complete halt right in the middle of the intersection. The brake lights flashed as the fuel pump instantly starved the engine. At the exact same second, the electronic deadbolts slammed shut, trapping them inside. Leo hijacked the integrated digital radio display, transmitting a blaring audio alert and a scrolling neon message across the dashboard screen. The message read, "Stolen property of Lawrence Bennett." Inside the car, panic erupted. The buyer realized instantly that he had been lured into a high-profile felony trap. He was a professional criminal, and he knew that a disabled car in a major intersection would attract the police in less than 60 seconds. We watched him frantically pull on the door handles, but the deadbolts held firm. In an act of pure desperation, he kicked his heavy work boot directly into the driver's side window. The vintage glass shattered outward, showering the asphalt. He scrambled out through the broken window, grabbed his aluminum briefcase full of cash from the lap of my stepdaughter, and sprinted blindly down a narrow alleyway, disappearing into the city. Melanie was left entirely alone, trapped inside a paralyzed stolen vehicle in the middle of a gridlocked intersection. Horns began to blare aggressively from every direction. Through the camera feed, I could see her screaming and beating her fists against the passenger window, terrified and utterly humiliated. Within 3 minutes, 2 black and white patrol cars cut through the stalled traffic with their sirens flashing. The officers approached the vehicle with their weapons drawn, demanding she unlock the doors. Since Melanie was locked inside, the officers used tactical batons to smash the remaining glass and drag her out by her arms. They pushed her against the hood of my car, snapping heavy metal handcuffs onto her wrists. She was sobbing hysterically, screaming that the car belonged to her dying stepfather and that she had the legal right to sell it. The officers ignored her, pointing directly at the glowing dashboard display that repeatedly labeled her a car thief. Back in the warehouse, Leo intercepted the police radio dispatch. They were running her identity through the state database. But Leo was digging much deeper into her personal communications, tracing the frantic text messages she had sent just hours before trying to sell the car. He decrypted a hidden messaging application on her phone. He read the intercepted texts aloud to me in the cold warehouse. She did not need the $80,000 to pay for her mother's lawyers. She was completely drowning in underground gambling debts. The messages were from an illicit sports betting syndicate. She had leveraged her mother's anticipated inheritance to borrow massive sums of money to fund a severe gambling addiction. The bookies had given her a hard deadline of noon today, threatening brutal physical violence if she did not deliver the cash. She had tried to sell my prized vehicle simply to save her own legs from being broken by violent debt collectors. I looked at the frozen image of Melanie crying on the hood of my car, surrounded by police officers. She had played a dangerous game with my life, and now she was going to face the brutal reality of the criminal underworld she had blindly stepped into. Her mother could not save her because her mother was about to face her own absolute destruction. I turned away from the screen, pouring myself a fresh cup of black coffee. The stepdaughter was officially neutralized. Now it was time to orchestrate the final grand performance for my loving wife. Have you ever encountered someone who created a disaster out of their own greed? The final pieces were sliding perfectly into place. Through the audio feed, I listened as Barbara moved through the mansion, her heels clicking a staccato rhythm of absolute confidence. She was entirely oblivious to the federal investigation, the broken doctor, and her stepdaughter's catastrophic arrest. To Barbara, the silence meant victory. It meant I was either lying dead in a ditch or wandering the city completely lost in the delusion she had meticulously fabricated. She was free, and with that perceived freedom came an overwhelming, blinding hubris. She was not going to wait for a funeral. She was not going to wait for a body. She wanted to celebrate. Over the hidden microphones, Leo and I listened as Barbara orchestrated her masterpiece. She was planning an event she called an estate liquidation and memorial mixer. She instructed the household staff to clear the main ballroom and set up elegant display tables. She was hiring a private catering company, ordering cases of imported champagne, and sending out digital invitations to the city's elite. The guest list was a who's who of wealthy socialites, rival business tycoons, and high-end art collectors. She was inviting the exact people who had smiled at me at charity galas and corporate dinners, inviting them to drink my wine and bid on my life's work before the sun even set. She told her party planner that it was a celebration of my life, a way to raise funds for a charity in my name. But as soon as she hung up the phone, she muttered the truth to herself. She needed the immediate cash from the silent auction of my vintage watches, my original paintings, and my antique firearm collection to pay off her boutique law firm. She was throwing a party to fund her own legal defense using my money. The sheer audacity was staggering. I sat in the cold, dim warehouse and let out a low, dark laugh. It was the perfect ending. If she had quietly packed her bags and tried to disappear, tracking her down would have taken time. But her endless greed, her desperate need to be the center of high society, had drawn her right out into the open. She was building the very stage for her own public execution. I turned to Leo, who was finalizing the encryption on the digital files we had gathered. The authentic toxicology reports, the confessions, the financial records proving her massive fraud, and the documented federal investigation involving the forged medical papers. We had built an impenetrable arsenal of truth. "It is time to get dressed," I told him, standing up from the metal folding chair. In the back of the warehouse, inside a locked climate-controlled storage unit, I kept a small wardrobe of emergency business attire. In the logistics industry, you never know when you might have to step off a dirty loading dock and directly into a high-stakes board meeting. I pulled out a sharp, perfectly tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a deep crimson tie. I took my time getting dressed. I stood in front of a cracked, full-length mirror propped against a concrete pillar. The man staring back at me was no longer the pale, poisoned victim lying in a sterile hospital bed. The deep purple bags under my eyes had faded. The sickly gray tint to my skin was gone. I looked strong. I looked dangerous. I looked exactly like the man who had built a billion-dollar empire from nothing. Leo emerged from the office wearing a dark suit of his own. He looked sharp, professional, and entirely lethal. He was carrying a sleek silver briefcase. Inside that briefcase was the digital death warrant for my treacherous wife. "Are we ready?" Leo asked, adjusting his cuffs. I adjusted my tie, pulling the knot tight against my collar. "We are going to a party," I replied. The drive across the city felt different this time. We were not fleeing in the shadows of the night. We were driving directly toward the center of the storm. The afternoon sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long, dramatic shadows across the pavement. I stared out the passenger window, feeling a profound sense of calm wash over me. The rage that had fueled my survival over the last 48 hours had crystallized into pure, focused intent. As we approached the sprawling gated perimeter of my estate, the sheer scale of Barbara's arrogance became fully visible. The long, winding driveway was packed with luxury vehicles. Valets in crisp white shirts were busy parking expensive sports cars and sleek sedans. The front doors of the mansion were thrown wide open, spilling warm, golden light and the soft murmur of classical music out onto the manicured lawn. Leo pulled the rusted utility van off the main road, parking it discreetly behind a thick grove of oak trees near the edge of the property line. We did not need an invitation, and we certainly were not going to walk through the front door like ordinary guests. I knew this property better than the architects who designed it. We slipped through a gap in the dense wrought iron fencing, moving silently through the shadows of the expansive gardens. The cool evening air carried the faint, sweet scent of the expensive catering and the sharp, unmistakable sound of clinking champagne glasses. We bypassed the busy kitchen entrance, utilizing a narrow stone pathway that led directly to the private service corridor behind the main ballroom. I paused in the dim, narrow hallway, listening to the swelling noise of the crowd just on the other side of the heavy wooden double doors. The steady hum of 200 voices, chatting, laughing, and casually bidding on my most prized possessions. And rising above the noise cutting through the sophisticated chatter was Barbara's voice. She was speaking into a microphone, her tone dripping with manufactured grief and dramatic flair. She was thanking everyone for coming, thanking them for supporting her during this incredibly tragic, heartbreaking time. She was spinning her masterpiece of lies, completely unaware that the ghost she was mourning was standing exactly 10 feet away. I looked at Leo. He gave me a single sharp nod, his hand resting securely on the silver briefcase. The trap was perfectly set. The audience was captive. The antagonist was standing center stage, basking in her stolen glory. I reached out and placed my hands flat against the cool, polished wood of the double doors. I took one final deep breath, feeling the air fill my healthy, unpoisoned lungs. It was time to end the show. Through the narrow crack between the heavy wooden doors, I watched the vultures feast. The grand ballroom of my estate had been completely transformed. The massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over a sea of expensive dark suits and glittering evening gowns. Over 200 of the city elite had answered my wife's invitation. I saw rival logistics tycoons, politicians I had funded, and high society socialites who only knew my name because it was printed on charity gala programs. They were all standing in my home, drinking my vintage champagne and laughing softly, as if they were attending a weekend cocktail hour instead of a memorial service. Waiters in crisp white uniforms navigated through the dense crowd, carrying silver trays lined with crystal flutes. A string quartet was positioned in the far corner of the room, playing a slow, mournful melody that was just quiet enough to allow the guests to gossip comfortably. The sheer disrespect of the event was staggering. There were no somber faces. There was no genuine grief. It was a high-class networking event built entirely on the foundation of my supposed demise. My eyes drifted away from the crowd and focused on the perimeter of the ballroom. Barbara had brought in long, velvet-covered tables to display the spoils of her victory. I felt a cold knot of pure disgust tighten in my stomach as I recognized the items she was selling. My collection of rare vintage watches was lined up in illuminated glass cases. Original oil paintings that I had spent decades carefully curating were mounted on wooden easels with small, elegant bid cards resting on the tables below them. Even my antique hunting rifles were on display. She had stripped my private study, my bedroom, and my hidden safes to gather anything that could be easily liquidated for untraceable cash. She was turning the legacy of a self-made billionaire into a high society yard sale. I watched a prominent commercial real estate developer lean over and inspect a gold watch I had purchased in Geneva 20 years ago. He chuckled and wrote a number on the bidding card before taking another sip of his champagne. They were picking the meat off my bones while they thought my body was still warm. Then the soft, mournful music faded away. A sharp, melodic chime rang through the ballroom as someone tapped a silver spoon against a crystal glass. The low murmur of the crowd gradually quieted down, and the guests turned their attention toward the grand marble fireplace at the end of the room. Barbara stepped up onto a small elevated platform they had constructed specifically for this moment. She looked absolutely flawless. She was wearing a stunning, tailored black dress that managed to look both somberly respectful and incredibly expensive. A delicate black lace veil was pinned to her hair, partially shadowing her face. She held a silver microphone in her perfectly manicured hands. She took a slow, shuddering breath, playing the role of the exhausted, heartbroken wife with the skill of a seasoned actress. "Thank you," she began, her voice echoing softly through the hidden speakers placed around the room. "Thank you all so much for coming here tonight. Your presence brings me more comfort than you could ever possibly know." She paused, letting the silence stretch out, allowing the guests to offer her their undivided, sympathetic attention. I stood in the dark corridor, gripping the edge of the wooden door, my knuckles turning white. "As many of you know, my beloved husband Lawrence has been battling a terrible, invisible illness." Barbara continued, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "The doctors told us his mind was failing. They warned me that the brilliant, strong man who built a nationwide empire from nothing was slowly slipping away from us. I tried so hard to protect him. I tried to keep him safe here in our home, but the dementia was simply too aggressive." She stopped and pressed a white silk handkerchief to her cheek, wiping away a tear that I knew did not exist. I listened to her spin her web of lies to the very people I had done business with for decades. She was looking them right in the eyes and telling them that I was a broken, confused old man who had lost his grip on reality. 2 days ago, his paranoia reached a tragic peak, she said, her voice breaking perfectly on cue. He ripped out his life-saving medical equipment and fled the hospital. The authorities are still searching for him, but the doctors have warned me to prepare for the absolute worst. They told me that without his medications, his heart simply cannot sustain him. A collective murmur of sympathy rolled through the ballroom. I saw a few wealthy socialites place their hands over their hearts. I saw rival executives shake their heads in feigned sorrow. Barbara had them completely mesmerized. She was controlling the entire narrative, isolating my legacy, and ensuring that if my body was ever found at the bottom of a river, no one would ask a single question. They would just assume the crazy old man had finally wandered too far. "But Lawrence would never want us to sit in the dark and cry," Barbara declared, raising her chin with a brave, resilient smile. "He was a man of action. He was a man who loved building things and helping others. That is why I decided to open our home tonight. I could not just sit and wait for the terrible news. I wanted to celebrate the incredible life he lived before the illness took him away." She gestured gracefully toward the velvet-covered tables lining the walls. "Lawrence collected many beautiful things during his remarkable life," she told the crowd. "But material possessions mean nothing without the person you love to share them with. I have decided to auction these private collections tonight. Every dollar you bid on his watches, his art, and his personal treasures will go directly into a new charitable foundation I am establishing in his name. A foundation dedicated to helping families who are suffering from the devastating effects of severe mental decline." It was the most brilliant, twisted lie she had ever told. She was standing in my house using my attempted murder as a tragic backstory to solicit cash bids from my peers, and she was disguising her desperate need to pay off corrupt doctors and lawyers as a noble charitable endeavor. The sheer magnitude of her hubris was almost difficult to comprehend. "Please," she whispered into the microphone, offering the crowd one final tearful smile. drink his favorite champagne, tell stories about the sharp, ruthless businessman you all knew and respected. And please bid generously. Help me ensure that Lawrence Bennett is remembered for the light he brought into this world, not the darkness that consumed his final days. The ballroom erupted into warm, respectful applause. Barbara lowered the microphone and bowed her head gracefully, accepting the adulation and the sympathy of the city elite. She stepped down from the platform and was immediately surrounded by wealthy friends offering their condolences and their checkbooks. I watched her accept a fresh glass of champagne from a passing waiter. She took a sip and glanced over the rim of the crystal flute, looking at the bidding cards filling up with massive numbers. I saw the flash of genuine triumphant joy in her eyes. The mask of the grieving widow slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing the greedy, calculating parasite hiding underneath. She truly believed she had achieved the impossible. She thought she had outsmarted a billionaire, forged the perfect medical alibi, and secured a massive, untraceable payday. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her fraudulent empire was already dead. She had no idea that her secret accounts were frozen. Her stepdaughter was currently sitting in a police interrogation room, and her corrupt doctor had already surrendered to my lawyers. She was basking in her stolen glory, completely unaware that the ghost she had just eulogized was breathing perfectly fine just a few feet away. I turned away from the crack in the door and looked at Leo. He was standing patiently in the shadows, holding the silver briefcase that contained the absolute truth. I adjusted the cuffs of my tailored suit one last time. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut. The memorial mixer had reached its peak, and it was finally time for the guest of honor to make his appearance. When my wife and stepdaughter heard the doctor say I had only 2 days left, my wife held my hand, smiled, and whispered finally, "2 more days, then it is all mine." My stepdaughter added, "I am taking his car." After they left, I called my gardener. "Help me, and you will never have to work again." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had your trust broken by the people closest to you, the ones you swore would always have your back. I stood in the dim corridor, with my hands resting flat against the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom. The muffled sounds of polite applause and the gentle scraping of crystal against silver filtered through the thick wood. Barbara had just finished her beautiful, poisonous eulogy. It was time. I looked to my left. Douglas Pierce, my corporate attorney, stood perfectly still, his tailored suit immaculate, holding a thick leather portfolio that contained the legal destruction of my wife. I looked to my right. Leo held the silver briefcase, his expression hard and completely focused. I gave them a single nod. I pushed the heavy oak doors. They swung inward with a deep, resonating groan that immediately cut through the sophisticated chatter of the room. I stepped over the threshold and into the warm golden light of the crystal chandeliers. I did not slouch. I did not limp. I stood at my full height, my shoulders pulled back, radiating the kind of absolute, undeniable health that defied the tragic narrative my wife had just sold to the entire room. For a fraction of a second, the party continued. Then a waiter standing near the entrance turned to offer me a drink. The color instantly drained from his face. The silver tray slipped from his trembling hands. It hit the marble floor with a violent, explosive crash. Dozens of crystal champagne flutes shattered into thousands of pieces, the sound ringing out like a gunshot in the cavernous ballroom. The music halted in a jarring, discordant screech as the cellist dragged his bow sharply across the strings. The sudden silence that fell over the room was absolute and suffocating. 200 of the most powerful people in the city turned to look at the entrance. Conversations died in their throats. People froze with their drinks halfway to their mouths. I saw prominent politicians, ruthless real estate developers, and wealthy socialites stare at me as if a corpse had just crawled out of a grave and walked into their cocktail hour. The crowd parted instinctively, stepping back to create a wide, empty path down the center of the room. At the far end of this ballroom, standing on the elevated velvet platform, was Barbara. She had a crystal flute of imported champagne pressed to her lips. When her eyes locked onto mine, her entire body went completely rigid. The glass slipped from her manicured fingers, dropping to the floor and shattering against the wood, sending a spray of expensive wine across the hem of her designer morning dress. She did not scream. She did not speak. Absolute paralyzing shock locked her muscles. Her jaw went slack, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. She looked exactly like a woman who had just watched her perfect, untouchable world disintegrate into dust. I walked down the center of the ballroom. I did not rush. I let the sharp, rhythmic echo of my leather shoes ring out in the dead silence of the room. Leo and Douglas walked a step behind me, acting as an impenetrable wall of authority. The guests stared at us, their eyes wide with disbelief and growing horror. They looked at the healthy color in my face, the sharp cut of my suit, and the cold, unyielding focus in my eyes. The narrative Barbara had carefully constructed about a frail, demented old man dying in a hospital bed evaporated into thin air with every step I took. I reached the elevated platform. Barbara took a weak, stumbling step backward, her eyes wide with a primal, unfiltered terror. She looked at me as if expecting me to collapse, as if hoping this was some drug-induced hallucination. But I was terrifyingly real. I stepped up onto the platform and closed the distance between us. She was trembling so violently that the black lace veil pinned to her hair shook. "Hello, Barbara," I said, my voice completely calm, yet carrying enough weight to freeze the blood in her veins. "I apologize for being late to my own memorial." She gasped, a choked, pathetic sound escaping her throat. "Lawrence," she whispered, her voice barely audible, shaking with panic. "How are you? How are you here?" I did not answer her question. I simply reached out and took the silver microphone from her trembling hands. She surrendered it without a fight, her fingers slipping away as if she had lost all motor control. I turned my back to her and faced the sea of stunned, silent guests. I looked at the extravagant displays of my personal art, the illuminated cases holding my watches, and the bidding cards resting on the tables. The sheer disrespect of it all fueled the cold fire burning in my chest. I raised the microphone. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice booming through the hidden speakers, washing over the paralyzed crowd. "I want to thank you all for coming out tonight to support my wife during what must be an incredibly confusing time for her. As you can clearly see, reports of my mental decline and my impending death have been greatly exaggerated." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. I saw a few executives exchange horrified glances, realizing they had just been tricked into participating in a fraudulent estate liquidation. I kept my voice steady, projecting absolute authority. "Barbara has spun a very compelling story for you tonight." I continued, my gaze sweeping across the room. "She told you about a man losing his mind. She told you about a man who needed to be locked away for his own safety. She asked you to open your wallets to buy my most prized possessions under the guise of charity. But my wife left out a few critical details about my sudden, miraculous recovery." I turned slightly, looking back at Barbara. She was hyperventilating, her chest heaving as she backed herself against the marble fireplace. She looked frantically toward the exit, calculating her chances of escape, but Leo had already moved to block the stairs leading down from the platform. She was completely trapped on the stage she had built for herself. "My wife forgot to mention the special herbal teas she has been brewing for me over the last 6 months," I said, turning back to the crowd. "She forgot to mention the steady, lethal doses of heavy metals she has been slipping into my drinks every single night. She forgot to tell you that the reason I was lying in a hospital bed with failing kidneys was not because of a tragic natural illness, but because the woman standing behind me was methodically, patiently trying to murder me in my own home." The ballroom erupted into chaos. Shocked cries and horrified murmurs broke the silence. People backed away from the display tables as if the items were cursed. I saw a prominent city judge who had known me for years pull out his cell phone, his face pale with disgust. The socialites who had been offering Barbara their deepest sympathies just minutes ago now looked at her with pure, unfiltered revulsion. "Lawrence, please," Barbara sobbed, her voice amplified slightly by her proximity to the microphone. "You are confused. You are sick. Please stop this. I lowered the microphone slightly and turned to face her. The crowd fell silent again, straining to hear the confrontation. I am not sick, Barbara, I replied, making sure my voice carried across the room. I was poisoned, and you are not a grieving widow. You are a failed assassin who got impatient. I signaled to Leo. He stepped forward, opening the silver briefcase. He pulled out a small remote digital projector and linked it to the massive presentation screen Barbara had set up to display the auction items. It was time to stop dealing in accusations and start displaying the undeniable scientific truth. The curtain was falling on her beautiful lie, and the lights were about to expose every single dark corner of her fraudulent existence. The massive digital screen behind the velvet platform had been projecting a tasteful, elegant photograph of me all evening. It was a picture taken 5 years ago during a charity gala. Below my smiling face was the logo of the fake foundation Barbara had invented to steal money from my peers. I gave Leo a single sharp nod. He pressed a button on his remote device. The screen blinked black for a fraction of a second. When the image returned, my smiling photograph was gone. In its place was a stark clinical laboratory document. The stark white background and heavy black text bathed the ballroom in a harsh, unforgiving light. I raised the silver microphone to my lips. My voice echoed through the silent room, carrying the cold weight of absolute truth. What you are looking at is my official toxicology report, I announced. It was taken less than 24 hours ago by an independent physician. If you direct your attention to the highlighted section in the center of the screen, you will see the results of my blood work. I paused, allowing the 200 guests to read the document. I watched the city elite narrow their eyes and squint at the screen. Slowly, a wave of horrified comprehension began to ripple through the crowd. You will notice dangerously high levels of thallium, I continued. For those of you unfamiliar with chemistry, thallium is a heavy metal. It is highly toxic, odorless, and tasteless. It is the primary active ingredient in commercial rat poison. It causes severe neurological damage, excruciating muscle failure, and eventually cardiac arrest. It perfectly mimics the natural decay of a failing body. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers. A prominent city councilwoman standing near the front row covered her mouth with both hands. A billionaire real estate developer who had just bid on my vintage watches took 3 deliberate steps away from the display tables, as if the items themselves were contaminated with poison. Barbara let out a desperate, high-pitched sob. She grabbed the edge of the wooden podium to keep her knees from giving out. Lawrence, she cried, her voice cracking with panic. That is a forgery. You are sick. You are having a paranoid episode. Someone please call the police. He does not know what he is doing. She turned to the crowd, pleading with her eyes, begging the wealthy socialites to believe her carefully constructed narrative. But the societal elite are not fools. They are predators who know how to spot blood in the water. They looked at the indisputable scientific evidence on the massive screen, and then they looked at my perfectly healthy, steady posture. They knew exactly who was lying. I did not raise my voice. I simply let her desperate lies hang in the air for a moment before delivering the next fatal blow. I signaled Leo again. The screen blinked. The toxicology report vanished, and a new document appeared. This one was not a laboratory result. It was a formal legal affidavit bearing the official seal of the state and a sprawling, highly recognizable signature at the bottom. I know many of you are familiar with Dr. Simon Keller, I said, watching several heads nod in the audience. He caters to the most exclusive families in this city. He has been my primary physician for the last decade. My wife trusted him completely. In fact, she trusted him so much, she offered him $200,000 to sign my death warrant. Barbara let out a gut-wrenching shriek. She lunged forward, trying to grab the microphone from my hand, but Douglas Pierce stepped effortlessly between us. My corporate attorney did not say a word. He simply glared at her with such intense, absolute disgust that she stumbled backward, retreating to the far corner of the stage. I turned my attention back to the captivated audience. The document on the screen is a sworn confession, signed by Dr. Keller. Just a few hours ago, I explained reading the text aloud for those in the back of the room. In it, he admits to accepting massive financial bribes from my wife. He admits to willfully ignoring the obvious signs of heavy metal poisoning. He confesses to fabricating a diagnosis of severe late-stage dementia to justify a fraudulent emergency conservatorship. He admits that he and my wife meticulously planned to let me die in a hospital bed so she could inherit my entire logistics empire. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. The elegant, sophisticated atmosphere had completely evaporated. The room had transformed into a brutal public tribunal, and I was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Barbara was backed into a corner, her designer mourning dress clinging to her trembling body. She was breathing rapidly, her chest heaving as she looked around the room for a single sympathetic face. She found none. The women she had sipped tea with at country clubs looked at her with pure, unfiltered revulsion. The men she had tried to charm and manipulate stared at her with cold, calculating contempt. She was entirely isolated. The grand societal pedestal she had built for herself was crumbling into dust under her feet. "Did you really think I would not find out, Barbara?" I asked, turning to face her directly. "Did you really think you could sit across from me at the dinner table, smile at me, and pour rat poison into my tea every single night without me noticing the bitter taste of your betrayal?" She shook her head wildly, tears streaming down her pale face, ruining her perfect makeup. "No," she whimpered. "It is a lie. All of it is a lie. I loved you, Lawrence. I took care of you. You took care of my bank accounts," I corrected her, my voice echoing sharply. "You took care of my estate. You never loved me. You loved the empire I built, and you were too lazy to build one for yourself." I looked out at the sea of guests. Many of these people had written massive checks tonight, believing they were donating to a noble medical charity. It was time to expose the final layer of her repulsive greed. "For those of you who generously placed bids on my personal property tonight, I have some unfortunate news," I announced. "There is no charitable foundation. There is no noble cause." My wife organized this entire memorial mixer for one simple reason. She needed untraceable liquid cash by tomorrow afternoon to pay off the corrupt doctor and the boutique law firm helping her orchestrate my murder. "You were not donating to charity. You were actively funding my assassination." A loud collective gasp of outrage swept through the ballroom. The wealthy elite do not mind ruthless business tactics, but they absolutely despise being used as pawns in a cheap criminal scheme. The judgment in the room solidified into a suffocating, heavy blanket of condemnation. A prominent venture capitalist, standing near the front, walked directly over to the display table holding my antique firearm collection. He picked up the bidding card he had signed just 10 minutes earlier and tore it perfectly in half, throwing the pieces onto the floor. Dozens of other guests immediately followed his lead. They abandoned their champagne glasses and turned their backs on the auction tables entirely. Barbara watched her massive, untraceable payday literally ripped to shreds in front of her eyes. She fell to her knees on the elevated platform, the sheer weight of the public humiliation pressing her firmly into the ground. She covered her face with her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. There was no escape. There was no clever lie that could save her. The entire city elite had just witnessed her absolute destruction. I stood over her, looking down at the pathetic, broken woman who had tried to erase me from the world. I felt no pity. I felt no sorrow. I only felt the cold, precise satisfaction of a man who had successfully reclaimed his life. The truth was fully unveiled, and the predator had been completely disarmed. But the execution was not over yet. It was time to bring down the legal hammer and sever her from my world forever. I turned back to the massive digital screen that loomed over the silent ballroom. There was still one lingering thread of this poisonous family tree that needed to be severed in front of the entire city. My stepdaughter was noticeably absent from this grand memorial mixer, and it was time to explain exactly why. I gave Leo a subtle nod. The projector clicked and the forged medical confession vanished. In its place, a harsh, brightly lit police booking photograph appeared. It was Melanie, Her designer mascara was smeared down her cheeks, her expression captured in a moment of pure, panicked devastation. A fresh wave of whispers flooded the ballroom. I raised the microphone, my voice cutting through the noise with absolute authority. "Many of you might be wondering why my devoted stepdaughter is not here to mourn my tragic passing," I said, looking down at Barbara, whose tear-streaked face had suddenly gone entirely rigid. "The truth is, Melanie had a very busy afternoon scheduled. While you were all putting on your finest suits and gowns, she was attempting to sell my vintage classic car to an underground chop shop operator in the middle of downtown." I paused, letting the sheer absurdity and criminality of the act settle over the wealthy crowd. But she was not doing it to pay for my medical care. I continued, my tone hardening. She was doing it because she is drowning in severe illicit gambling debts. She owes hundreds of thousands of dollars to an illegal sports betting syndicate, and they gave her a hard deadline of noon today. She thought she could liquidate my private property to save herself from violent debt collectors. Instead, she tripped the military-grade security system I personally designed for that vehicle. She was dragged out of the locked car by armed police officers and arrested for grand theft auto right in the middle of a crowded intersection. She is currently sitting in a municipal holding cell, waiting for a mother who is never going to come rescue her. Barbara let out a hollow, suffocating gasp. The realization that her daughter had completely ruined the secondary cash flow plan hit her like a physical blow. Her entire family operation was in ruins. There was no money. There was no escape route. The illusion of their sophisticated high society life had been stripped away, exposing them as nothing more than desperate common criminals. I stepped back, allowing the sharp, immaculate figure of Douglas Pierce to take center stage on the velvet platform. My corporate attorney did not carry a microphone. He did not need one. When a man like Douglas enters a room, his presence alone commands absolute silence. He unbuttoned his suit jacket with a slow, deliberate calmness and opened the thick leather portfolio he had been carrying under his arm. He looked down at Barbara, who was still kneeling on the floor, shivering in her ruined designer dress. He pulled a massive stack of crisp legal documents from the portfolio and dropped them directly at her feet. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the polished wood echoed fiercely across the grand ballroom. Barbara Douglas began, his voice smooth, resonant, and entirely devoid of mercy. "You are being officially served. The documents sitting in front of you contain a comprehensive filing for immediate divorce. Attached to that filing is a massive civil lawsuit for fraud, extortion, and attempted murder. We have already submitted the evidence to the district attorney, and criminal charges are actively pending." Barbara stared blankly at the thick stack of legal paper, her hands trembling so violently she could not even reach out to touch them. Douglas did not give her a second to breathe. Furthermore, Douglas continued, his tone dropping an octave, becoming a lethal professional weapon. "You will find an emergency eviction notice authorized by the Shadow Trust that now legally owns this entire estate. You do not own this mansion. You do not own the cars in the driveway. You do not own the very ground you are kneeling on. You have exactly 30 minutes to collect whatever cheap personal clothing you can fit into a single suitcase and vacate the premises. If you are still standing on this property when the clock strikes 9, the private security contractors waiting in the hall will physically remove you and throw you onto the street." The brutal, uncompromising finality of his words snapped something deep inside Barbara. The sheer terror of losing her lavish lifestyle suddenly mutated into a frantic, cornered rage. The carefully crafted mask of the grieving widow was completely obliterated, replaced by the rabid, snarling face of a woman who refused to let go of the wealth she felt she was owed. She scrambled to her feet, her high heels scraping aggressively against the wood. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face, her voice rising into a shrill, desperate scream that pierced the silent ballroom. "You cannot do this to me!" she shrieked, her face twisting into an ugly mask of pure entitlement. "I am your wife. I gave you 10 years of my life. I sat in this house while you built your empire. I put up with your endless business trips and your obsessive control. I earned my place in this family. The law protects me. We are married, Lawrence. You cannot just throw me out into the street with nothing. I am entitled to half of this estate. I am entitled to half the bank accounts, half the properties, and half of your miserable company. I will drag you through the courts for a decade. I will bleed you dry in alimony." She stood there, chest heaving, screaming her demands at a man she had actively tried to murder just hours prior. The absolute unhinged delusion of her greed was staggering. She truly believed that the legal system of a civilized society would still protect her financial interests after she had tried to poison me to death. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to argue with her. I simply looked at Douglas. My attorney smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that showed far too many teeth. He reached into his leather portfolio one final time and pulled out a single, pristine sheet of paper. He held it up for Barbara to see. "It is incredibly tragic how short your memory is," Barbara Douglas said, his voice laced with venomous amusement. "Do you recognize this document? It is the prenuptial agreement you signed 10 years ago. You remember, do you not? The one you complained was far too thick and complicated to read properly. The one you confidently signed because you believed you could manipulate your way around it." Barbara froze, her furious momentum suddenly evaporating. She stared at the paper in his hand, her eyes darting back and forth as if trying to decipher the legal jargon from 10 feet away. "Allow me to refresh your memory," Douglas continued, stepping closer to her, delivering the final fatal strike. Section 4, paragraph 9. It states quite clearly that in the event of a divorce, you are entitled to a generous severance package. However, there is a very specific ironclad contingency clause attached to that section. Douglas paused, letting the anticipation build in the dead silent ballroom. The 200 wealthy guests watched with bated breath, witnessing the absolute masterclass in legal annihilation. The clause dictates, Douglas read loudly, articulating every single syllable with lethal precision, that any proven attempt to cause severe physical harm, orchestrate medical fraud, or endanger the life of the primary asset holder immediately and irrevocably voids all spousal claims. It completely nullifies your right to alimony. It strips you of any claim to the properties, the corporate shares, and the personal accounts. It leaves you with absolutely zero. The words hung in the air, heavy and definitive. The legal trap I had set 10 years ago had just snapped shut on her neck. In short, Barbara Douglas said, lowering the document and staring directly into her terrified, defeated eyes, "You get absolutely nothing. You do not get half the company. You do not get the cars. You do not get a single dime of Lawrence Bennett's money. You are walking out of these doors tonight with exactly what you brought into this marriage. Absolutely nothing." Barbara swayed on her feet. The reality of her absolute irreversible ruin crashed down upon her. She had tried to steal an empire, and in doing so, she had legally incinerated her own golden parachute. She was a 58-year-old woman with no assets, no home, no powerful friends, and a pending criminal indictment for attempted murder. She looked around the ballroom one last time, searching the faces of the societal elite she had so desperately tried to impress. They stared back at her with nothing but cold, silent judgment. She was entirely erased from their world. The silence inside the grand ballroom was so profound that the faint sound approaching from the distance felt like a physical vibration. At first, it was just a low wail echoing over the manicured hills of the estate. Then it grew louder. The distinct, piercing shriek of multiple police sirens cut through the cool evening air. The sound bounced off the high stone walls of the mansion, completely shattering the fragile tension in the room. I looked over at Douglas. My attorney simply adjusted his silver cufflinks and gave me a brief, knowing nod. He had made the call to the local precinct exactly 10 minutes ago, timing it with absolute perfection. He had provided the chief of police with a direct encrypted link to the toxicology reports, the forged medical documents, and the recorded confession from the corrupt doctor. The authorities were not arriving to ask polite questions. They were arriving to execute a highly coordinated arrest. Barbara heard the sirens. The last remaining ounce of color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a hollow, fragile shell. She turned her head slowly toward the towering glass windows of the ballroom. Flashing red and blue lights began to paint the dark glass, washing over the terrified faces of the wealthy guests in rhythmic, aggressive pulses. The reality of her situation finally breached the thick walls of her delusion. There was no more manipulating. There was no more acting. The authorities were at the front door. Heavy footsteps pounded against the marble floor of the grand foyer. 6 uniformed police officers and 2 plainclothes detectives marched directly into the ballroom. They did not pause to admire the crystal chandeliers or the expensive catering displays. They moved with absolute tactical precision, parting the sea of stunned socialites until they reached the velvet platform. The lead detective, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, stepped up onto the stage. He looked briefly at me, offering a small, respectful nod, before turning his full attention to the trembling woman kneeling on the floor. He stated her full name, reading her rights in a loud, clear voice that left absolutely no room for negotiation. He ordered her to stand up and place her hands behind her back. Barbara did not resist. Her body was completely limp. The shock had paralyzed her nervous system. An officer stepped behind her and pulled her arms back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs snapping shut echoed loudly across the quiet room. She was wearing a dress that cost more than most people earn in a year, and she was leaving my house in chains. Douglas approached the lead detective and handed him a thick, sealed folder containing the physical copies of all our gathered evidence. The detective thanked him and signaled for his officers to move. 2 uniformed men grabbed Barbara by the arms and began to march her down the center of the ballroom. It was the ultimate walk of shame. The 200 wealthy guests who had been drinking her champagne just 30 minutes prior now stood completely silent, watching her humiliating exit. They parted to create a wide path, refusing to make eye contact with her. She was a ghost walking through a graveyard of her own ruined reputation. I followed slowly behind them, letting Leo guide me through the crowd. I wanted to watch her leave my property for the very last time. The cool night air hit my face as we stepped out through the main front doors and onto the sprawling stone driveway. The entire perimeter of the estate was illuminated by the flashing lights of 6 police cruisers. But there was a surprise waiting for Barbara by the lead detective car. Standing next to the rear door of a black and white patrol vehicle was Melanie. She was still wearing the designer clothes from her disastrous afternoon, but her wrists were securely bound in heavy metal handcuffs. Her face was streaked with ruined makeup, and her eyes were wild with absolute panic. The police had transferred her from the municipal holding cell to the estate to formally process the conspiracy charges alongside her mother. When Melanie saw Barbara being led out of the mansion, the final thread of their toxic alliance violently snapped. The fear of spending decades in a federal prison completely destroyed any lingering sense of family loyalty. Melanie lunged forward, fighting against the grip of the officer holding her arm. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice echoing across the driveway. She pointed her bound hands directly at Barbara and began to aggressively shift the entire blame. She told the detectives that she had absolutely nothing to do with the heavy metal poisoning. She shrieked that the forged medical documents, the fake conservatorship, and the secret offshore payments were entirely her mother's dark creations. She claimed she was just a terrified pawn acting under strict orders. She called her mother a monster and begged the police to offer her a plea deal in exchange for her full cooperation. Barbara stopped walking. She stared at her daughter with an expression of pure, agonizing betrayal. The child she had manipulated the legal system to protect, the daughter she had secured a fraudulent inheritance for, was now actively throwing her to the wolves to save her own skin. Barbara opened her mouth to speak, to defend herself, or perhaps to apologize, but no words came out. The absolute devastation of realizing she had raised a daughter just as treacherous as she was seemed to break her spirit completely. The officers did not allow them to speak further. They shoved Melanie roughly into the back seat of the first patrol car, slamming the heavy door shut and cutting off her hysterical screaming. Another officer guided Barbara toward a separate cruiser. She looked over her shoulder one last time, staring directly into my eyes. She was searching for a sliver of mercy, a shred of the unconditional love she had abused for a decade. I offered her nothing but a cold, blank stare. The officer pushed her head down and forced her into the back seat of the police vehicle. The engines roared to life. The sirens wailed again, piercing the quiet night, as the convoy of police cars rolled down the long, winding driveway and disappeared through the iron gates. I stood on the front steps of my mansion, listening to the sirens fade into the distance. Behind me, the ballroom began to empty. The wealthy socialites and powerful executives filed out of the front doors in stunned, absolute silence. They kept their heads down, hurrying to their luxury cars, eager to escape the immediate proximity of such a profound public destruction. No one spoke to me. No one offered false condolences. They simply scattered into the night, leaving the estate as quiet and peaceful as a tomb. The heavy steel doors of the warehouse rolled down for the final time that night, shutting out the cold city wind. The vast concrete space was quiet. It was a sharp contrast to the chaotic flashing lights and screaming sirens we had just left behind at the estate. I walked over to the folding metal table and sat down in the worn leather chair. The intense adrenaline that had fueled me for the past 48 hours was finally beginning to fade. In its place, a deep, profound sense of absolute peace settled over my chest. I took a slow, deep breath, filling my lungs completely. There was no metallic taste in my mouth. There was no poison in my veins. I was entirely free. Leo stood near the small office window, packing away his laptop and the audio receivers. He moved with the same quiet humility he had always shown, whether he was pulling weeds in my garden or hacking into a global financial network. He had risked his own freedom, his safety, and his future to save the life of an old man. He had proven that his loyalty was unshakable. It was time to pay my debts. I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. Douglas Pierce had given it to me right before we left the mansion. I placed it flat on the center of the metal table. I called Leo over and told him to sit down. He looked at the envelope with a hint of confusion. He wiped his hands on his dark jeans and sat across from me. I looked him right in the eyes. I told him that building a massive logistics empire from a dirt lot had taught me exactly one undeniable truth about the world. You can buy fleets of trucks, you can buy warehouses, and you can certainly buy expensive lawyers, but you can never buy genuine loyalty. When Barbara tried to erase me from existence, she relied on greed and fear to control her accomplices. Her empire crumbled in a single day because the people she bought turned on her the second the ship began to sink. I slid the envelope across the metal table. I told Leo to open it. He carefully broke the seal and pulled out the crisp legal documents inside. His eyes scanned the heavy corporate text. I watched his breath hitch in his throat as he realized exactly what he was holding. It was not a temporary blind trust. It was a permanent binding partnership agreement. I was legally transferring 50% of my entire billion-dollar freight company directly into his name. He was no longer a groundskeeper. He was no longer a hidden asset. He was the co-owner of the largest logistics network on the eastern seaboard. Leo looked up at me completely speechless. He shook his head slowly, pushing the papers back across the table. He told me it was too much. He said he helped me because it was the right thing to do, not because he wanted to steal half my company. I smiled a genuine warm smile. I pushed the documents right back to him. I told him he was not stealing anything. I told him he had earned every single penny. I needed a partner who understood how to navigate the dark, who knew how to find the blind spots, and who would never sell me out for a quick payday. I handed him a pen and told him to sign his name. He took a deep, shaky breath and signed the papers. The ghost operation was officially over. A new empire was born. 6 months passed. The winter thawed into a bright, crisp spring. The highly publicized criminal trials dominated the city news cycle for weeks. Barbara and Melanie turned on each other violently in the courtroom, each trying to save herself by destroying the other. The judge showed absolutely zero mercy. They were both sentenced to decades in federal prison. Dr. Simon Keller lost his medical license, his fortune, and his freedom. My former family was completely erased from the world of the wealthy elite. They became nothing more than a cautionary tale. My physical recovery was complete. The doctors confirmed that the heavy metals were entirely flushed from my organs. I felt stronger and sharper than I had in 10 years. The toxic fog that had clouded my home and my mind was entirely lifted. On a warm Saturday morning, I walked into my private temperature-controlled garage. The faint, familiar smell of motor oil and polished leather hung in the air. Sitting in the center of the pristine concrete floor was my 1969 Shelby GT 500. The shattered driver's side window had been perfectly replaced. The brilliant metallic paint gleamed under the bright overhead lights. It was a beautiful, immaculate machine. It was a symbol of my survival. I opened the heavy door and slid into the driver's seat. The vintage leather groaned softly under my weight. I gripped the wooden steering wheel, feeling the smooth, solid texture against my palms. I slowly turned my head and looked at the passenger seat. For the last 10 years, that seat had been occupied by a woman who secretly plotted my demise. It had been filled with lies, manipulation, and endless, suffocating greed. Now the passenger seat was completely empty. There was no one telling me how to drive. There was no one asking for my money. There was absolutely nothing but quiet, unbroken peace. I pushed the heavy silver key into the ignition and turned it hard. The massive engine roared to life, sending a deep, powerful vibration through my entire body. It was the sound of pure, unbridled freedom. I shifted the car into gear and pressed my foot firmly on the gas pedal. The garage doors rolled open, revealing a bright, endless stretch of open road. I drove out of the estate, feeling the warm spring wind rush through the open windows. I looked up into the rearview mirror one last time. The mansion grew smaller and smaller until it completely disappeared behind the trees. I did not look back again. I just kept driving, perfectly content to leave the ashes of my past entirely in the dust. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that true wealth has absolutely nothing to do with the money in your bank account or the properties you own. Real wealth is found in the unshakable loyalty of the people who stand by you when they believe you have nothing left to offer them. Greed is a blinding disease that can turn your own family into predators, but if you have the courage to walk away from toxic relationships, you will discover that the peace of mind you gain is worth more than any empire you could ever build. Never let anyone use your love and generosity as a weapon to destroy you. If this story resonated with you, please leave a comment below, sharing your own experiences with setting boundaries, and do not forget to like and subscribe for more stories of survival and justice.